Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to SAIS. My name is Johannes Urpelainen. I am the Director of the Energy Resources and Environment Program here, and I'm so glad to see all of you. Thanks so much for joining us today. I think we are going to have a very exciting set of panels. We have a great keynote speaker. We have excellent panelists, both from our faculty and outside the institution as guests and our visitors. This is the first annual ERE conference. It will be the first of many. We hope that we can do this for a long time. Here in the ERE program, we have a keen interest in the challenge of energy transition and deep decarbonization. We think that our strength is in an interdisciplinary approach to dealing with the sustainability aspects of our energy system and society more broadly. We have excellent expertise in science and technology, economics, governance, and politics. So we take a broad view of these issues. Today, we are going to tackle these challenges, and I hope that at the end of the day, you will all leave this room with lots of great ideas, maybe a little bit daunted by the magnitude of the challenge, but also inspired by the opportunities and new thinking. An institution like SAIS should really be at the forefront, being based here at the nation's capital and with all this excellence, both academic and practical. Okay, so I don't want to keep you for much longer. I think the keynote and the panels will be much more interesting than anything I would have to say, but I do have to thank my colleague, Professor John Banks, for organizing this. He's done an outstanding job. John is there at the back. If you don't know him, he's one of our excellent teachers. Thank you, John. And again, thanks so much for coming, and I hope we'll keep in touch. We all need to work together if we want to solve this problem. And with that, I'd like to invite my colleague from SAIS Europe, from our Bologna campus, Professor Marco Del Aquila. Marco, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be back, and especially nice because I can see so many familiar faces, former students and classmates. My name is Marco Dell'Aquila. Good try, Johannes, on my surname. Maybe we can practice that a bit. I'll practice yours and you practice mine. So to teach at SAIS, you need to have a very complicated and foreign-sounding name. I'm an adjunct faculty member within the RE program, and I teach in Bologna, Italy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. As Johannes mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the approaches that we've taken and the lessons learned from the energy transition, which effectively encapsulates the value chain from fossil fuels right the way through to renewables. You can probably imagine this is an incredibly ambitious thing to achieve within an afternoon, but we at SAIS like challenges, so this is what we're going to try and do. And I'm joined clearly today by two incredible panels and our esteemed guest, Congressman Tonko. We're going to divide today into a panel dealing with global transition and then a panel focusing on US issues. And clearly, we welcome your questions, and they don't have to be following the structure of the panels. In our audience today, I can see lots of ERE students, and then some of you may not be ERE students. And I hope those of you who aren't ERE students will get an opportunity of engaging with us all here, students and teachers, to discover the breadth of learning and understanding of energy issues and environmental matters. So SAIS is a unique institution within Johns Hopkins, and we are famous because we are multidisciplinary as well as an international institution. And when we apply our thinking to different topics, I think we can be very innovative in our approaches. I was asking the RE department, when were we actually formed as a group? And the best answer I got was sometime in the 1990s. And thank you, Margelle Hyatt, who is the director on the administrative side. I was a student here, Bologna 84-85 and Washington 85-86, and we didn't have an ERE program. although we did have energy courses, and around the 1990s, the interest the institution had, and I think student demand drove, let's say, coalesced into a proper program. And I think today we've had almost a generation, half a generation of SICEs who have graduated as energy, resources and environment students and are now practitioners in the field. And I think, and I'm very passionate, and I think it's a very, very important topic. So we face a huge challenge. Some of us are practitioners, others have a passion in the interest, and our interests align in different industries, whether it's as teachers, academics, or whether it's as people who work within multilateral institutions, banks, and energy companies. And we're here to discuss how we can address the energy challenge. And in looking at the challenges that we face, it's very important to have leadership. And for that, I think since Professor Johannes Urpilainen took over, there's been a distinct shift and a focus in the ERE concentration. And I think over the next year or so, you will see many changes. And for that, I'm particularly pleased. Today, we have some 50 students in ERE, actually in 1 year, 50 in another year, so close to 100, and possibly another 10 in Bologna and 2 or 3 in Nanjing. So we have quite a large body of students that are going through the school. And clearly today we only have our Washington colleagues, but I think our Nanjing and Bologna colleagues are here in spirit. Let me move to the order of the day, the energy transition. So from where I sit, which is somewhere between academia, industry, and the world of finance, I see an accelerating global consensus as to the need to address changing climate. And for the first time, there's an alignment of interests, both between the various stakeholders and also in the general public. And with certain exceptions, and as you'll hear from my accent, that I speak maybe from a slightly more European perspective, there is an alignment that there is a commitment from all stakeholders to deal in a committed way to the reduction of global temperatures below the 1.5 degrees C. As James Lovelock would say, the patient Earth is sick and is manifesting worrying symptoms caused by human activity. And we read those every day, so it's not as if these aren't newsworthy. We see the wildfires in California, the loss of the Greenland ice shelf, intense hurricanes, unbearable ambient temperatures in the Middle East, and loss of habitat. Many, many things. And also from where I sit, based in London, although I do teach in Bologna, I've even learned that the situation is so bad the French champagne producers have begun to buy land in southern England because they realize that within 20 years, they will no longer be able to produce their beloved champagne in France. So everybody's waking up and reacting to global climate change. So these climate trends give rise to a broader debate. Has there ever been a greater challenge facing humanity than the need to transition from fossil fuels to a decarbonized economy? As we look at the themes, namely how we undertake the transition at sufficient scale and the actual acceleration needed to achieve it, I'd like to maybe refer to a paper that a good friend of mine has written, the CEO of the Rocky Mountain Institute, and he has co-authored a paper that looks at the speed of the energy transition. In the paper, he posits 2 trajectories, not surprisingly. One which is a sort of gradual evolution of the status quo, moving as we are today, concerned, but not a dramatic change. And in that scenario, not wanting to give you the answer of the paper, we're not going to achieve the 1.5% temperature. And then an alternative scenario in which all the stakeholders take a more concerted action, and there's a much more rapid rollout of clean and sustainable technologies, and the rollout of these technologies is sufficient to meet the rising global demand. And that is not just in a vacuum, but it's in the context of new energy policies to shape markets, new and innovative, hard, put my teeth in, innovative business models, and also changing demand-side consumption patterns. And if all of those things come together, and I know you're skeptical, I can see it in your eyes, then peak fossil fuel demand occurs somewhere in the mid-2020s and begins to decline. So, you know, you are all smart people there, and we can probably realize that the reality is it's neither on the low trajectory or the high trajectory, but somewhere in between. And we today, as a SAIS community, need to be active participants in the discourse to help to bring our professional expertise and passion to this very, very important debate, and to ensure that our voices are heard, and together with the voices of other key policymakers, such as our very esteemed keynote speaker, Congressman Tonko, who's been very outspoken, and other leaders of private sector companies around the world, academics, and not to forget the role of the general public. I mean, it hasn't gone unnoticed that over the last several months, a whole movement within the general population, and we see it a lot in Europe, and the reaction to Greta Thunberg, you know, and what she's done has been immense. And what that's done is it's inspired effectively a new generation of youngsters, and hopefully those youngsters will grow up and be my students. Let me, and students of SAIS in general, let's talk about the specific themes. And let me just lay them out for you without going into detail, because they're going to be dealt with in the conference. So first of all, within the transition, we have, can we achieve net zero emissions? Is decarbonization at 100% possible? Second theme, can we electrify everything? And third, decentralized renewable energy technologies. This is just a taster, and hopefully more. Can I now turn to Congressman Tonko? Thank you so much for coming today. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our inaugural session. Can I just say a little about your resume to everyone here? And I'm sure you know, everyone knows your background, but I should really introduce you formally. So Congressman Tonko represents New York's 20th Congressional District, and that includes Albany, Schenectady, Troy, Saratoga Springs, and Amsterdam. You're serving your 6th term, and you were sworn into Congress in 2009. So importantly, you serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which I learned was the oldest committee formed in 1795. And you are the first member of that committee from upstate New York in over half a century. And you're also elected to the 116th Congress to chair the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change, which is the subject of today's talk. And for that, we are very, very honored to have you. And can I add a personal note? I'm very happy that you are speaking today, because I started my energy career at GE. As you know well, GE's home is Schenectady, and I would say Schenectady is probably the home of the US power market. So without further ado, Congressman Tonko.
Thank you, Professor Diakla. And it is great to join everyone here for what is a great opportunity to participate with SAIS and share some thoughts. Certainly, I appreciate the opportunity to join with each and every one of you here this afternoon. As you heard, I'm Paul Tonko, and it's an upstate New York district that I represent. And this year I've been given that awesome responsibility of serving as chair of the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee that reports to the Standing Committee of Energy and Commerce. This is where the next major comprehensive climate bill is most likely to originate. I've spent that past 10.5 months as chair holding hearings, stakeholder meetings, and just trying to build momentum around climate action in Congress. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit of my perspective on this issue and certainly on the challenges and opportunities for future action. In recent months, we have all been witnessing the increasing public awareness and demand for federal climate action. And I really appreciate the passion and the sense of urgency that people, especially young people, are bringing into this debate. But despite this support, we still have big challenges to get where we need to be on clean energy innovation, on deployment, and certainly on emissions reduction. Some of that must start with an acknowledgement of our current political constraints. Enacting a comprehensive climate bill is not going to be possible this Congress. I said that recently, and people seem shocked to hear it. But that is the reality of President Trump's views as a denier. And while many of my Republican colleagues in Congress have begun to be more serious and constructive in the discussion, they are not ready to support a major climate bill. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 passed by 401 to 435 as a vote in the House. For those of you too young to know, it included a cap-and-trade program to combat acid rain, which has proven to work. But despite the new bipartisan rhetoric, we are still a long way from that level of action. With that being said, we know there are meaningful policies that stand a chance of garnering bipartisan, bicameral support right now, a sort of different track that will accompany our main track on climate pricing, on carbon pricing. I see a few areas where we might be able to make progress in this, the 116th session of Congress. First, on clean energy tax incentives. Provisions like the ITC and PTC are not ideal policies, but given our constraints, and those are investment tax credit and production tax credits, they may be the best we can do at this time. I recently joined colleagues to launch a letter calling for several of these tax policies to be included in must-pass legislation this year. We have specially identified a fix for the EV tax credit, creation of a standalone storage, ITC, extension of the ITC for all other technologies, including making wind eligible and energy efficiency credits as priorities. Second, there is strong support for energy R&D programs. As we move forward on appropriations, I really hope that we can restore proposed cuts to all of the energy research offices. I am also excited by the work being done by Chairwoman Johnson and the House Science Committee. Bills to authorize parts of EERE and ARPA-E and address industrial decarbonization have all moved through committee. These bills, for example, the ARPA-E reauthorization, have support ranging from the United States Chamber of Commerce to NRDC to many groups in between. The energy innovation agenda is critical. We must push DOE to focus on long-duration storage, low-emissions industrial products, cleaner fuels for aviation and shipping, battery recycling and disposal, and direct air capture technology development, amongst other areas where we truly need breakthroughs. Third, on energy efficiency. The House Energy and Commerce Committee has advanced several efficiency bills, including a reauthorization of the Weatherization Assistance Program. These are just a few areas where I believe we can work together. For those of us that truly believe we are experiencing a climate crisis, we have a responsibility to be honest about our current political realities and try to get as much enacted right now as possible. While many of these short-term areas include well-developed policies, I also want to bring fresh ideas into our policy debates. I've been working on a number of new bills that I hope will be introduced in the coming months that are focused on, and I'll mention a few here, streamlining the permitting process for distributed energy resources such as rooftop solar, deploying more publicly accessible EV charging infrastructure, and enabling the grid infrastructure necessary to to deploy vast amounts of remotely located renewable energy by improving the interregional planning process for transmission. We cannot achieve our clean energy targets without building new and expanding the capacity of existing lines. As we work on these smaller issues, we must also be developing comprehensive legislation, which has been at the core of what the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee has been doing. This includes assessing what has changed over the past 10 years, understanding the lessons learned from the experiences of other countries and our United States on how to develop or design better policies and avoid pitfalls, and working to build consensus amongst the many stakeholders and members. In July, the committee announced that we would hold hearings and stakeholder meetings with the goal of developing legislation to transition to our efforts for a 100% clean economy, defined as net zero greenhouse gas emissions, by the year 2050. It is clear that getting to net zero will be a challenge, but we need to start as soon as possible and make every major reduction possible in the very next term. While there is no consensus yet on the best pathway to achieve this scientifically necessary target, we have the benefit of a number of credible climate modelers who generally agree on the fastest and most effective strategy for rapid decarbonization. Based on what we know, we intend to advance policies that would include reducing energy demand and improving energy efficiency, deploying new and preserving existing clean electricity resources, enabling electrification across all sectors of the economy, and finally, utilizing carbon dioxide removal through natural and technological methods. So far, we have held hearings on pathways to decarbonization and reducing emissions from industry, from buildings, and I literally just came from a hearing focused on heavy-duty transportation. The purpose of all these hearings has been to acknowledge that, along with opportunities, the clean energy transition will bring challenges. Rather than overlooking these foreseeable concerns, we seek to understand them and mitigate any potential harms. That is why the committee is working to provide fairness and opportunities for workers and implement a transition plan for communities and individuals that face disruptions, to ensure the transition works for all Americans, including those facing historic inequities and environmental injustices, maintain energy affordability to avoid harming America's most vulnerable people, preserve and improve United States competitiveness, particularly in manufacturing industries, and finally, incentivize and innovate climate solutions for energy services and industrial processes that currently do not have a viable pathway to decarbonization. People do not like to talk about the challenges, but I see my institutional role in the House of Representatives to develop the tools and policies that get us moving toward achieving our goals. And that work must be done in a way that is science and evidence-based, with the goal of building a broad coalition of support that can get 218 votes in the House. I believe this can be done, at least in part, through market-based policies, but the policy design matters. A price signal is a power tool that is both proven effective and efficient. It can naturally align many other decisions and policies from the government and private sector, but carbon pricing, in whatever its form, must include emissions reduction certainty. It is also not a silver bullet. I believe we need a comprehensive portfolio of solutions built around a clear price signal that also makes meaningful investments in R&D, in infrastructure, in efficiency, in environmental remediation, and certainly in community transition. I am committed to advancing a plan that is as ambitious as possible, as soon as possible, and we must be prepared to move at the earliest opportunity. I hope that if you take anything away from today, it is that windows of opportunity need to be planned for long before they open. We do not know when we can advance major climate legislation, hopefully in January of 2021, but we just do not know. I was involved in the Waxman-Markey debate a decade ago, and I can say that we are living in a different world now in 2019. The energy landscape is different. Clean energy alternatives are cost competitive throughout the nation. The commitments of many states, of many local governments, and many businesses are incredibly more ambitious. The quality of policy design is much more sophisticated. And perhaps most importantly, public awareness, especially around climate damages, has grown. The next time we have this debate, it won't just be pictures of sad polar bears. People understand this in their backyards, and one of the greatest challenges of their lifetimes exists. But despite these changes, we are still fighting against time, and the business of legislating can be slow and very difficult as a piece of work. It took more than it took more than 5 years to get that 2009 bill from concept to a vote in the House. A few years ago, I worked on an effort to reform the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA. TSCA was a law that was widely acknowledged to be broken since nearly its inception over 40 years prior. But during all that time, Congress did nothing to fix it. Even when industry, environmentalists, and the Obama administration largely agreed, it still took us many years of work to enact TSCA reform, even with some level of bipartisan consensus. When it comes to climate, time is not our friend. We are up against the clock. The science is clear, but the legislative process tells us it is going to take time to develop the language, build the consensus, and get it over the finish line. We have at least 14 months where major legislation will not be signed into law. We need to use this time to the fullest and start to write the next comprehensive climate bill. And that is exactly what the Energy and Commerce Committee is doing. I hope to have more information on the details of this legislative package in the very near future. But for now, I would just say that I am optimistic that we can accomplish some of these near-term priorities, and I welcome anyone's perspective on the long-term goals we are working toward. I want to thank everyone again for the invitation to join with you this afternoon, and I would be happy to hear any comments or questions that you might have. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. We're okay for time? I'm looking at my crew.
5 minutes? Okay, well, in that case.
We have votes
There we go.
shortly, so I just wanted to be fair with you.
Okay, we'll keep this quick. I was going to ask a question, but since we only have 5 minutes, I would prefer that we put it out there to the students. So let's privilege SAIS students with a question. I'm Professor Jordan, by the way. Let's privilege SAIS students with questions to Representative Tonko, please. Please do raise your hand. There we go. Yes, can you bring over a mic, please?
Hi, my name is Jamie. Good afternoon, Congressman.
Good afternoon.
My boyfriend lives in your area, so it's really nice to meet you. From my understanding of the area, like I've had the opportunity to, visit a couple of times over the years. In terms of the public awareness of this energy transition, it doesn't necessarily feel it's very much out there. And you spoke about public engagement. So could you maybe elaborate on the concrete efforts to maybe get more awareness out there and to facilitate the energy transition?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And I applaud your boyfriend's choice of congressional districts. In terms of public awareness, recently, a few months ago, in my congressional district in upstate New York, we held a climate town hall. And it was a good way to bring people together from various perspectives. There was no invitation list. It was open to the general public. We alerted them to the opportunity. And it was great to hear people talk about everything from solutions for this whole crisis and denial about the concept of climate change. I think that community dialogue is important. And we need to understand that some of this damage that's being done is impacting us severely. And at these town halls, which I would encourage all my colleagues to host, we can come to the conclusion, I believe, quite justifiably, that the cost of inaction far surpasses the cost of response here, of action to the climate crisis. It's not going to be cheap. It's going to cost us. We need to invest. But we have seen that we have to dig deeper and deeper into the taxpayer's pocket, be it federal or state taxpayer pocket, to remediate, to recover, and to mitigate. We have had severe storms in New York State, some that have taught us major lessons on how to address infrastructure and the like. But the cost of inaction is a powerful thing. As I also stated in my comments, it's grown well beyond polar bears and coastal erosion. It's flooding in Nebraska. It's rising, historic risings of the Mississippi that alert our senses, and it's become a backyard issue, and we need to familiarize people with that whole characterization. But thank you.
Here we have another question over here.
Hi, my name's Marjorie Dodson. I'm also a student here in Energy Resources and Environment. My question is about basically the affordability. So you talked about affordability, maintaining affordability of energy, but you also talked about reducing demand. And a lot of us here are studying economics, and one of the things that we're studying is basically you have to increase prices to reduce the consumption. So I was wondering what solutions, because I also agree that it's important to have affordability, especially in terms of environmental justice. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
You're right, that supply and demand issue is something that gets addressed in the economics. Energy efficiency should be seen as our fuel of choice. And as we reduce demand by that whole concept, there's also the acknowledgement that we're growing as a world population. There's industrial comebacks in many nations. We have had a dip about 10 years ago in our economy, and now it's surging forward again, upward, beginning with policies in March of '09 that began to, with the efforts to come back from the recession with the Obama administration, are now finding their virtues met, and we're having a more robust economy. So while that is happening, it's becoming more and more important for affordability's sake that energy efficiency be introduced into the mix so that fuel of choice will balance out the situation as it relates to affordability and will enable us from the economics forefront to be able to do that. I think there's also some other benefits that come with the reliance on renewables and providing localized more opportunity to decentralize our generation facilities to ease the impact on the grid situation, so that some of those opportunities, I think, will bend the cost curve. Thank you, Marjorie.
Okay, we have one last question with respect to your time. Mickey, do you want to stand up?
Good afternoon, Congress. My name is Mickey. Last year, I had a professor who said that energy efficiency often goes unnoticed because it's not a sexy issue. Do you see that changing in the political landscape?
Mickey, I think that the challenge there is, while it may not be sexy, to use your word, I think people understand that we have to be resourceful. There are increased opportunities for us to provide for a good mix in our generation of energy. And no matter what that supply might be, it's important for us to be resourceful. And so I think the challenges become, how can you address that demand side? And we need to make that a competitive thing, And I think businesses will see that as sexy, because if they can reduce their cost of production, I can tell you a long time ago when I was energy chair in the New York State Assembly, energy audits and energy retrofits were kind of like, looked down upon. Industry would say, you don't know our business, you're coming in and telling us to do all these great things. We have a unique situation here. And that grew into knocking on your door, asking if they could have an audit in later years of my Assembly energy chairmanship. And then when I went to NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, which does a lot of interaction with the private sector, they were demanding these audits and demanding retrofits. So people are catching on. They understand that they can control their destiny with all of that. And it's across the sectors. We did great energy efficiency retrofits with the ag industry, and we do it all the way over to manufacturing. So it's a tool that people are becoming more and more familiar with, and it is becoming sexier with time.
Okay, so we do understand, we would love to keep you here longer because SAIS students would be able to keep you here all afternoon with questions, but we do understand your political responsibilities, so I would like to ask for everyone to thank the Congressman for his time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jordan, Professor Jordan. And let me just say, I wish we could spend more time, but my first responsibilities are to be on that floor voting for legislation that's important. But, you know, I leave with this statement, maybe we can do it again, or let's do it again. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone. More time for us. That's the upside. My name is Nikos Tsafos. I'm a senior fellow with the Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm also a SAIS alum and a former SAIS lecturer. So now I've moved on to moderator. I'm not sure if that's going in the right or the wrong direction. But either way, I'm very excited to be back here. And I'm particularly excited for this event and for this panel because we have a great lineup. We have a star lineup. So the way we've organized this day is we're going to kick off talking about the world, and then the next panel is going to talk about the United States. So what I wanted to do first is introduce our panel. I mean, you've read their bios and all that, but just very quickly, on the far end, we have Gina Wang Rees, who's a vice president of political and public affairs with the Norwegian company Equinor. Next to her is Sandra Cohen, who's the director of innovation at Enel Green Power North America. The other SAIS alum on the table, on the panel, well represented. Next to him is Helen Mountford, who's a vice president of climate and economics with the World Resources Institute. And then next to me is Johanna Perlinen, who's the director of the Energy Resources and Environment Program here at SAIS. So we have a great lineup, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So what I wanted to do is we deliberately structured this panel to bring different voices into this conversation. We have, two people from the academia, think tank world, and then two representatives for private industry. So what I wanted to do as a first round was kind of ask each of the panelists to give a sense of how do they think about the challenge of the energy transition from their specific vantage point. And then that's going to take us through a few minutes, and then I'm going to do a few rounds of follow-up questions, and then we're going to come to you and bring you into the conversation. So I wanted to start with you, Helen, see if you can maybe start at the beginning, frame things for us. You're the first of sort of 8 panelists to come, so maybe give us a sense of, where do we need to be, where are we, and then we can pick up the conversation from that.
Thanks very much, Nikos. I will try with a sort of broad framing and then go into some of the trends that we're seeing where we see some very good news, but also some bad news, where there's the positives and where there are some of the barriers that are stopping us from moving as fast as we need on the energy transition. So first of all, if I start at, I won't start at the very beginning, but I will start back in Paris 5 years ago. In 2015, in Paris, we had 196 countries and the European Union agree to the Paris Agreement. And one of the fundamental tenets of that was that we should aim to keep global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally towards 1.5 degrees Celsius, as far as possible, aiming towards 1.5. What we've actually seen since then is a couple of things. One, in terms of the science, it's become clearer and clearer that we actually really do want to aim for that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. We don't want to go to 2 degrees. We've had reports from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which brings together the world's greatest scientists working on climate change. We've had one on the 1.5C, one on land use, one on oceans recently. On 1.5C, they're very clear. The difference between 2 degrees Celsius global warming and 1.5, while it seems very small, is actually quite significant. Under 2 degrees Celsius, we would have double the amount of losses in fisheries and crops from global warming than we would under 1.5C. We would have almost 3 times, or perhaps a little bit more than 3 times as many people exposed globally to extreme heat incidents. So the difference is actually quite significant. So first, we've had some trends in terms of what we've seen in terms of the science. Others have already spoken about how we're actually seeing this already in the ground in terms of heat waves, extreme events, wildfires. So we're seeing the consequences, and we understand even better the scientific consequences. So we want to do that. In Paris, countries signed up to what they can do, their nationally determined contributions on climate action. In Paris, when they did that, we knew they did not quite add up to enough to meet the 2 degrees or even 1.5C target. In fact, we're closer on line to 3 degrees Celsius or above that at the moment. But the good news is they were pretty smart then and thought, okay, we're not quite on track for where we need to go, but let's come back in 5 years. And next year, 2020, which is 5 years after Paris, countries are coming back to the table in Glasgow, Scotland, in November next year, and they're meant to be announcing what more they can do, how they can enhance ambition and ramp up action on climate change. So we've got an incredibly important moment next year where we need countries to come back and actually announce even more ambition. And the energy transition is going to be a fundamental part of that. So we do need to move that forward. Now let me start with 2 pieces of good news in terms of the trends, and then unfortunately that's counterbalanced with 3 pieces of bad news. So 2 on the good news front. First, what we have seen is the cost of clean energy has come down even in the 5 years since the Paris Agreement, the 4 years since Paris Agreement came into play. So in the last 5 years, the cost of solar PV has gone down by 65% globally. Wind has gone down by about 15%. So we've seen the cost coming down of clean energy. We've also seen new developments in terms of battery storage technologies, which allow off-grid renewables and better integration into the grid. So we've got new developments on technologies, new developments on the costs. It's really changing the whole picture, and I'm hoping we'll hear from some of the other panelists on this. Starting to become much more cost competitive, outbeating coal in many countries and regions around the world, and increasingly starting to outcompete natural gas as well. So that's one of the good pieces of news. That's even since the Paris Agreement. The other piece of good news is that I think the finance sector is really waking up to this. They're waking up to the risks of continuing to invest in high carbon assets, and we're starting to see a lot of the finance sector moving away from that. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the largest in the world, it's $1 trillion in assets, that has decided not only to move away from coal, but they've recommended moving away from investments in oil and gas. Now that Sovereign Wealth Fund was built on revenues from oil and gas. And from a purely financial perspective, nothing to do with climate, but purely financial, they're recommending that it's no longer useful for them to invest those revenues, that the sovereign wealth fund's money in gas and oil. So they're starting to shift. So the markets are starting to shift. We had in New York last month at the Climate Action Summit, we had a number of pension funds and insurers that came forward and said that by 2050, they will go to net zero in all of their investments, right? So their whole portfolio will go to net zero emissions by 2050, which is what we need for 1.5C. So we're starting to see some real positives, both in terms of clean energy transition and the economics therein, and also in terms of the finance sector shifting. Now let me get on to the 3 pieces of bad news, where we see some of the blocks. First, I've got just a couple of slides I want to share, just graphics to show you. This is one. One of the things we've got a challenge with is that even the absolute best energy analysts in the world can't keep up with these trends. So what this figure is showing you is successive years of projections from the International Energy Agency, probably the best group of energy analysts in the world. And what you can see starting from the bottom and going up is the projections from their World Energy Outlook each year in terms of, I believe this is solar PV, annual PV additions. And each year, everything they start projecting in terms of the future of solar PV The next year they find they've already surpassed that and surpassed it again and again. So they keep going up. So the reality, the actual, what we've seen in terms of solar PV additions is the black line. So that's what we're seeing in the real world. That each year, every single time they make projections, they keep thinking it's going to be quicker, it's going to be faster, but they don't even keep up with where we're seeing reality. Now, why does this matter? This matters because a lot of politicians, the advisors, investors, look at this and say they believe a lot of the projections. So what they're doing is they're making their investments or policy choices based on what they see in the projections. So when the real world is actually changing quicker, we're not able to pick up. So that's the second point of where we're seeing some of the challenges around policies. Policies aren't keeping up with the changing world that we see. And I want to give one example, and this goes back to what Representative Tonko mentioned. Carbon pricing is really an important and very efficient tool in our toolkit of how to address climate change. It is not a silver bullet, it needs to be combined with others, but carbon pricing is important. Now, unfortunately, there is a sort of media story that's been going around the last couple of years that carbon pricing is dead, it's not going to happen, it's falling off following, for example, the Yellow Vest protests in France. So we keep hearing this, but the reality is very different. This is what was happening in terms of carbon pricing in 2009. And if you look at this, the green is where there's emissions trading schemes, like cap and trade schemes, in place or about to be implemented, and the blue is where there's carbon taxes. So not a lot happening in 2009. This is what's happening today. Just this year, we've had Argentina, South Africa, and Singapore implement carbon pricing schemes in this last year in 2019. We have now 76 carbon pricing schemes around the world, either in countries or in states or provinces, and they cover about 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And they're starting to raise revenues. In 2018, the total revenues from these were something like $44 billion globally. So you're starting to get revenues, and that's important. It gets back to one of the questions asked earlier, I think by Marjorie, on how you can actually address low-income households and ensure the vulnerable are brought along. How you use those revenues is particularly important. So one of the barriers we're seeing is we are seeing some movement in terms of carbon pricing, in terms of the climate policies that are needed. Often it's in other countries, to be frank, at the moment. It's countries in Asia and parts of Latin and South America, even in Africa now. But it's not being recognized always by the media. So you start to get this sort of idea that it's not moving, nothing's happening. So there's both a bit of lethargy in the policy side, but there's actually even more lethargy in our impression of the policy side. Third, in terms of where the policies are going, actually, let me just quickly mention, I forgot to say, fossil fuel subsidy reform is the other part of the policy side where we have some real challenges. We have actually seen there's something like 40 countries that have been implementing fossil fuel subsidy reforms in recent years, which is fantastic. Despite this, fossil fuel subsidies globally amounted to something like $400 billion last year. Right, that's for exploration, for development, for consumption of fossil fuels. So we've still got a major challenge to actually address in terms of policies around subsidies for fossil fuels. So the third area I wanted to highlight in terms of where we see the bad news and the challenges is really around the resistance to movement and moving forward. Others have highlighted how impressive it is. We've got the youth on the street. We've got, I think, over more than 7 million people were actually out on the streets last month in countries around the world demanding greater climate action. So we've got an incredible movement going forward from the public and from the youth and others. But we're still seeing a lot of resistance around putting in place the policies needed to help support this energy transition. And some of this is the lethargy and the misinformation I've already highlighted, but some of this is also vested interests. And at the moment, if you're not watching, you should be watching what's happening in New York. The New York Attorney General and Exxon looking at what's happened there in some of the oil and gas companies. So you get the vested interest challenge. And then the other part I want to talk about is you also have some very real and valid concerns about how to make this energy transition work, how to do it in a way that is just and equitable for workers, for low-income households, and for communities. Now again, we have some good news on this side because we're starting to see how you can do this and how you can do it effectively. And we've got examples from countries around the world, from Uruguay to New Zealand and many in between. And often it's about having dialogues, so starting with social dialogues which bring in workers and trade unions together with utilities and energy companies, with local authorities and governments, and often with the local community colleges or universities as well. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of examples where we've seen some of these successes where you can actually really do a just, equitable transition in a way which is better for the economy and for people. One is British Columbia in Canada. I'd already mentioned about the carbon pricing. What we've seen there, they've had carbon pricing in place since 2008. There were big concerns. Would this actually negatively affect low-income or other households? They used some of the revenues. They had about 1.2 million in revenues each year, Canadian dollars. And they used some of those to help recycle them to low-income and middle-income households. And what they found after 10 years is that low-income and middle-income households were better off with carbon pricing than they would have been without the carbon pricing. So they owe more than adjusted for any costs that might have hit those households for carbon pricing. So it is possible. We've got the examples. Another example is around coal workers. And there's a number of countries and regions that are struggling with this and looking at how to help with the communities, how to help with workers to make the transition. And one I wanted to cite is actually Enel. So not from the North America side, but from Italy. And Enel in Italy is responsible for shutting 23 coal-fired plants over the coming years, 23. And so what they did was they organized dialogues with the local trade unions, with the local communities, and they've actually managed to find transition paths where they can actually help re-employ in other parts of the company most of the workers who are going to be losing their positions as the coal power plants close down. And Enel has committed to stay in place in the communities, those 23 communities, and actually help to develop either renewable energy if it's viable on site or to develop tech hubs with the local communities. So they've looked at solutions which work for the community, for the workers, and also for Enel and for the economy. So there are definitely opportunities here. Some of the work that we do through the New Climate Economy, we have seen that between now and 2030, there's the potential for a $26 trillion benefit, economic benefit globally from going low carbon if we do it right. There's the potential for 65 million new low carbon jobs just in 2030 alone, and the potential to avoid over 700,000 premature deaths from air pollution. There are real benefits from this transition. There are real opportunities. The costs have come down. The technologies are there. We need to seize it, and we need to overcome some of these barriers I mentioned in order to achieve it. But we have that chance. We can do it. We just need to move.
I feel like this is probably the cheeriest we're going to be. Maybe we should stop there and just kind of call the rest of it. No, but thank you. That was a great opening. Gina, I want to come to you. Give us a sense from how Equinor is thinking about this challenge.
Yeah. First, Equinor, we are a Norwegian-based international company. We are 20,000 employees in 30 countries. The last 15 years, we have invested more than $50 billion in the US. We are a top 5 Gulf of Mexico oil and gas producer. We are active onshore. But this summer, we won the bid to build the offshore wind farm outside of New York. So we, the oil and gas company from Norway, will power 500,000 homes in New York with clean energy. So Equinor has changed our strategy from being a focused oil and gas company to a broad energy company. We changed our strategy 2 years ago, not just to be good, because it's a business matter. When the context is changing, so must we. So we have a strategy in place to build a business in support of the Paris Agreement. So what have we done already? First, Helen, I can confirm that the price on carbon actually matters. When you saw the slide Helen presented, Norway has a carbon tax. So Equinor has stored 23 million tons of CO2 under the seabed the last 20 years because we have a carbon price. It's cheaper for us to store it than emitting it. That's why a carbon price is one of our key policy asks. Also, Equinor's CO2 intensity is half the industry average. So I'm actually quite proud to speak about what oil and gas companies can do. We have already done something. We are the leading company in the world on carbon capture and storage. We have 2 CCS projects in Norway, and we aim to build Europe's first full-scale CCUS project in close collaboration with the Norwegian government and Total and Shell. And hopefully, the Norwegian continental shelf can be the first hub for European companies so they can store their CO2 subsea, underground. So, how do we build a business in support of the Paris Agreement? I think we need to do many things, and we are engaging in policy asks. First, we need to support the Paris Agreement, which we do, and we need a carbon tax. They could be regional, preferably they should be international, but we need a price on carbon. One challenge that we see is that fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, still represent 80% of the global energy mix today. It's the same level as 30 years ago, despite a tremendous growth in renewable energy over the last decades. What does it tell us? Well, oil and gas and coal deliver to meet higher energy demand. Oil, gas, and coal is the answer to increased welfare and increased demand. And we see renewable energy delivers on the additional demand. So what do we need to do then? We need to decarbonize the current energy system, as well as building up renewable energy substantially. And that is Equinor's strategy. So we are looking into more CCS and also hydrogen. We have many projects to see if hydrogen could be developed cost efficiently in combination with CCS. Because hydrogen comes with CO2 as a byproduct, and if we can come up with a full value chain, we can deliver hydrogen as well as emission reductions. We need collaboration with authorities. We need partnerships within the industry. We are represented in quite many initiatives like the OGCI. And what I also find fascinating, which I think serves as an example, I think companies like us need to take climate considerations into the way we run our company. So we, for example, we connect climate performance with remuneration for senior executives. Our leaders are measured on success. If they reduce their emissions in their portfolios, they are actually measured on it. Isn't that great? Mm-hmm. I think so. And finally, we need new business models, more innovation. I believe that oil and gas companies should even look outside of our own industry. So we have accelerator programs with totally different companies to see if we can collaborate, generate new ideas to come up with new solutions. So that's it for me now.
Excellent, thank you. We'll come back to some of these things. Both of you have generated a bunch of questions, but I'm going to first have Johannes chime in a little bit with your perspective on where we are.
If you look at the global situation where we are right now and where we need to be, I think the key challenge here is really that while clean energy, and in particular wind and solar power in the power sector, have made a lot of progress, they are not yet actually reducing fossil fuel use. Yeah. So we are increasingly deploying new clean energy capacity so that the growth of fossil fuels has decreased. But we are not yet at the point where we are taking currently existing fossil fuel capacity and saying, we don't need this anymore because we can just build some clean alternatives to it. So that is really the way you can think about it. And that's why we are in this situation where we remain at 80% fossil fuels, despite the fact that we have these stunning decreases in the cost of generating solar and wind power. One important opportunity or kind of piece of good news that I'd like to add is that transportation for the longest time seemed like an almost impossible area to tackle. But increasingly now with electric mobility, other forms of sustainable mobility, we have an opportunity to make progress in transportation. And given that the climate challenge is really the entire economy, it's not just the power sector. So when we talk about wind and solar power, we're talking about electricity really today. We also need to deal with transportation, we need industry, agriculture, and deforestation. So in some sense, I think the opportunity and the optimistic prospect here is that we can next repeat what we've achieved in the power sector in transportation. And then we have 2 out of the sort of 4 or 5 major sectors moving into the right direction. Now, that's not going to be easy. Even in the power sector, if we look at countries like China and India, renewable energy still faces some pretty major challenges. And I think the most fundamental of them is really the intermittency issue. So the sun shines at a certain time of the 24-hour cycle, right? It doesn't shine all the time, unfortunately or fortunately. The wind also blows only at certain times. In countries like India, electricity demand peaks late at night. I think last year it was around 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. at night. That is a time when the wind doesn't really blow a whole lot and the sun certainly doesn't shine. So unless we make major progress in technologies like storage or have some kind of a demand side management revolution, we are increasingly adding renewable electricity capacity at times of the day when we don't really need it. And in India, we've now seen a situation where we have something like 15, 20% of the capacity in renewables, and on certain days, only 2% of the electricity is generated. So we've moved from a situation where the focus is on supply and generation to management of systems. And any one of you who studies social sciences, when you move from just add stuff to managing complex social and economic systems, it becomes a lot more difficult. So that's where I see really the challenge for all of us is how do we manage these systems and how do we transition in a way that it's not just about adding capacity, but it's really meeting the energy needs. And we need to do this in a situation where many countries are at a kind of a tipping point, right? So we have hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people who are now approaching the kind of income level where they're thinking maybe we should buy a fridge. Right now, what they have is lights, a mobile phone, and maybe a fan if they're lucky, right? Those things don't consume a lot of electricity. Once we get to the fridge level, everything changes. We've seen this already in Mexico, where electricity demand in some years grew over 10% a year because you had this middle class reaching a certain level of wealth. So how do we do that while trying to reduce emissions? I think that's where the challenge is going to be. So the way I would put it, as I said already in my opening remarks, this is really a daunting challenge. And I think we don't want to be too optimistic. We don't want to be complacent. We really have a lot of work to do here. But at the same time, given that we've made a lot of progress in the power sector, with 15, 20 years ago, the IEA saying that, oh, renewables are not going to grow at all outside the OECD. If we could do the same thing in transportation, and then later in industry and land use, I think we can make real progress here. But we have to be very careful. We need to look at these different sectors, and we need to be quite realistic about what's happening in different countries and not just try to reduce emissions, let's say, Europe or United States. We have to really think Southeast Asia, Africa, and all that. So that's why I think the global perspective is very important. I think it's going to be in fits and starts, but at the same time, the future is a lot more difficult to predict than the past, right? So I don't think we know exactly where we are going to go. There's a wide range of futures that are possible depending on the choices we make and how quickly we move. So I think Helen's point about the policy needs to really start to happen. We need to get countries to put carbon prices, put much more money on R&D, find innovative solutions, not just in the power sector, but deforestation, industry. Just industrial heat alone is a major challenge. What about bioenergy, biofuels? What do we do with those? How do we manage the side effects? It's going to be a wide range of things, and I think the key thing now, we really have to hope that in these coming years, when the countries come back under the Paris Agreement, they ratchet up their commitments, do it in a broad way, looking at different sectors, and really start some kind of catalyze some real movement. So I think the glass is somewhere between half full and half empty. It's in the end up to us which one it is.
I'm trying to think about what a glass that is somewhere between half full and half empty, what that glass actually looks like.
Schrodinger's glass.
That's part of my final exam in our intro to resources and environment.
Folks, you had a heads up, so think about that.
Prepare for it.
I really appreciate what you said, Hans, and I'll come back to a couple of things you said. One is I appreciate you putting the sort of sector by sector breakdown, because I think it's important to think about power, but also buildings, transport. My 2 cents, and I realize I'm a moderator, so I'll keep my commentary to a minimum, but one of the things that struck me is when I look at the power sector, where we've made a tremendous amount of progress, we actually really haven't, in the sense that the share of coal in power generation globally is exactly the same as it was in the year 2000. All we've done is switch from oil to gas and from nuclear to renewables. So the carbon intensity hasn't changed quite as much. So it's always striking to me that we're celebrating power generation, which is an area where we haven't made quite as much progress. So with that, I'm going to turn to Sandra and give us maybe
everything's great in NL's universe.
Okay. So maybe give us your perspective.
Sure. So my name is Sandra Cohen. I head up innovation for North America for NL Green Power. Very briefly, NL is a large multinational utility. We're based in Rome. We used to be the national utility for the country of Italy. I think the Bolognese out here know, right? So where you are, depending on where you are in the world, we exist in more than 30 countries now, and depending on where you are in the world, we are either a fully integrated, top-to-bottom utility, or here in the United States, we exist mostly as an independent power producer. So an owner and operator of renewable energy facilities on one side, and then more recently as a manager of sort of everything on the demand side with our NLX group, which is a company that's focused on EV infrastructure, demand side management, energy efficiency, and commercial industrial microgrids. So when we're talking about the energy transition for a company like NL, well, let me take this back. Long story short, I have slides and slides and slides. We're very large. We're the largest private operator of renewables in the world. We're also one of the largest retail networks of electricity in the world, private retail networks. So we have a lot of sort of biggest and largest. When I think about the energy transition for a company like NL, it really is the centerpiece and the primary tool behind one of our central corporate ideals, which is creating shared value. So NL, in this most recent iteration, has made a real corporate commitment that in order to maintain corporate sustainability, for us to be successful as a company and to maintain and continue as an ongoing venture in the future, everything that we do not only has to create value for the company, but also has to create value for the stakeholders and shareholders around us. That has really powerful implications. It means effectively that our economic and corporate sustainability is tied with environmental sustainability. So that manifests really in sort of two very large corporate goals for us, and which dictate and drive our strategy. One is that we are aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050, and we probably will get there faster than that. So not zero carbon, but balancing off our hydrocarbon and carbon assets with our renewable energy assets. And the second one is a full commitment to UN Sustainable Development Goals. So not just decarbonization, but also commitments to social and economic equality and sustainability. NL right now, where we are a company of about 90 gigawatts of capacity globally. So what that implies, and most of that is we're about 50-50 renewables. So we're just under 40 gigawatts, or actually just about 40 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity and balanced off by an equal amounts of natural gas, coal, and nuclear capacity. Over the next couple years, you'll see from our investment plan that we are investing less and less in our thermal generation capacities, less and less in our natural gas and coal, no more nukes at all. Less and less in our natural gas and coal capacity, and more in our renewable energy capacity, to the point where the overwhelming majority of the $17 billion of CapEx investment we're going to make in the next through 2021 will be in renewable energy. The second biggest component of that, so I would say 3/4 of that, something along those lines, is going to be renewable energy. And then the remainder of that will actually be in the other side, the networks. So the large scale sort of investment in smart meters, grid, that you need to support a large scale system that's driven by zero carbon resources. So the goal here is to progress more and more towards zero carbon. That's the exciting part. And then I can start getting into sort of what my job is. So part of that is we have the resources to get started on this journey. We don't have the resources to get there all the way. So what we are looking at is, and that is, in addition to this commitment to zero carbon, to carbon neutrality rather, we're making substantial investments in innovation. And what we mean by innovation is the introduction of both new technologies and new business models to enable this transition to happen. And it follows a number of different vectors. The first three vectors are all sort of somewhat economic approaches. So anything that allows us to reduce the cost of producing renewable energy, so cheaper wind, cheaper solar, cheaper geothermal, you name it. The joke in my office is that if you painted the gates a different color and you got me, reduce the cost by a couple cents per kilowatt, I'd be out there painting the gates. The other one is increase access to renewable energy, so renewable energy resources. So anything that allows us to generate more from improve the utilization of wind and solar energy. The third component are new renewable energy sources. This is where it starts getting interesting. So not only just wind and solar, but also looking into marine energy, looking into high altitude sort of kite wind generation solutions. So things that allow us to get at different renewable energy resources, right? So part of this is also getting at what we discussed earlier of, the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So when you start doing that, you start thinking about complex systems of economics and technology that need to be solved by a technology solution. And then sort of finish out this thought, we have sort of two other vectors. One are things that improve sustainability metrics. So this is, we are an operator of industrial facilities. So we, in our sense, have our own carbon impact. So this starts very basically of how do you improve energy waste and water impacts of our own facilities, from construction through operation. But it also improves sort of things like end of life. So as we start building larger and larger renewable energy facilities, we start thinking about materials recycling. We start thinking about second life batteries. We start thinking about how do you better integrate renewable energy, land use of renewable energy, so that we can build things closer to places where people actually live, and have less of an impact on their environment. And the third one, which is sort of fast through all the three, is worker safety. So anything that improves the way, we have an enormous workforce, both in terms of people who work for us. I think NL employs about 60,000 people, which is small for oil and gas, but it's large for renewables. And then plus contractors, plus EPCs, plus the person who comes and delivers coffee to Francesco Starace. So and to improve their safety and quality of life is paramount to this. So what we do is that's a lot of innovation, that's a lot of work, and it's work we can't do ourselves. And so where this loops around, so where all this starts from the top as a major sustainability effort in creating shared value and looking at things on a large economic basis, comes down to the bottom, where my team is focused on creating an environment of innovation, and creating a way of not just sort of thinking about this in terms of sort of big policy levers, but thinking about this thing and how we're actually going to turn this giant battleship of a company, right? And don't get me wrong, like NL has come a really long way as a company in the last decade. But sometimes at its heart, it really still is a battleship, right? It still is a former national utility and a former government agency. So it has some of those components to it sometimes. So it starts at the beginning. It starts with the culture of open innovation. So good ideas can come from anywhere. So in the same way, Equinor has innovation hubs. We have our own series of innovation hubs. These are staffed presences inside major innovation centers. So these are here here in the United States at Silicon Valley and in Boston. And we're trying to expand to other places. But these are places where we are actively present in R&D and technology communities, looking for new ideas, looking for new ways of doing things, and bringing them back to the company and trying out ideas. We also subscribe to the idea that ideas can come from anywhere. So I spend a lot of time with our plant operators. I spend a lot of time talking to our stakeholders, trying to understand what the complex business problems exist out there, and then how can we solve them with technology. The middle part of this is actually doing technology proof of concept pilots. So NL has a process that resembles our commercial development process. The key difference is that in the way that if we're building a large-scale wind farm, if it doesn't make a return on investment, we're not going to build it. I mean, we're still a business in that regard. My job is to work on quirkier and less defined areas of technology. So long duration energy storage is a huge piece of our business, right? So when you start looking at how do you build large scale renewables, you need energy storage, and you need large scale long duration energy storage, and that requires, that does two things. One, that requires thinking differently about energy storage technology, and two, it requires thinking differently about the economics of a plant. You can do a whole lot of different things if your energy storage starts looking really cheap and you start looking at 10-hour durations. So it's a process of then designing projects around these amorphous topics and developing metrics and KPIs, right? So, okay, we have this as a goal. How are we actually going to do it? And then once we get to the end of a successful innovation project, because I can confidently say that all of my projects are successful. We work on disseminating them. So we work on the process of cultural change. How do you get guys who have been really comfortable operating, especially engineers, operating a system in one way and getting them to operate a system in another way? And that requires, some level of economic incentive, but also some level of cultural change and improving a culture of innovation and environment. And I think that sort of gets at the last piece. So that's how we wind up sort of changing. And I think it's really interesting. It's also really hard. And it sort of leads me to the last point where I'll tie it back to what everyone else has been saying here, where part of this energy transition is promoting a culture of change. It's part of it is for us internally as NL, changing as a company and making the approach that this is something we want to do because it's important to us. It's also an effort of policy change. It's participating both in sort of the NGO and in the governmental and the state, local, global environments. Representative Tonko is an enormous leader of this, and fighting for that change, because part of this is what I've been finding is technology can adapt to markets really quickly. The issue is that the markets and policy don't change as fast. So I'll finish with a really short example that sort of ties it up. Is one thing that we look at is NL owns a series of very large wind facilities in the Midwest. By their structure, we encounter a series of economic challenges. So the projects still make a lot of money, they're still fine, but the challenges we face are multifaceted. They're technology. How would we implement storage to make their performance better or more consistent, or more able to offset the benefits we get from a thermal generation source without the externalities? But it's also how do you adapt a market? How do you get stakeholders in a market to move in a direction where they start seeing renewables plus storage as something that can provide the same value to the marketplace as a standalone thermal generation facility? And that requires a different way of thinking about energy markets and sometimes a little bit about policy. So I'll end there. And I can.
I mean,
talk
you're
about
going to end there, but I'm going to come back
Yeah, please do.
exactly on
Yeah.
that point, because you kind of teased us with it, and I want to go back to that point on the business model. So I'll come back to you. So I want to do a little bit of a follow-up, and I'm particularly interested if you guys want to disagree with one another, you're free to jump in. But I wanted to sort of come back to you, maybe, Helen. And I guess one of the things that struck me from your slides and your remarks that I couldn't quite wrap my head around is, what is it that we're missing? Is it we haven't told the story, we haven't gotten out of the streets enough, we haven't come up with a clever tools? Because clearly we have a lot of good progress to make, but we're nowhere near sort of up to the challenge. So when you think about what's happening out there, what are the things that excite you that, like, yes, more of that, this, more of the same, I don't get super excited?
I think it's actually a combination of things we're missing. I do think it is partly the story and the coherent story across a whole economy. We tend to work in most countries in ministries that have a silo, and they each have their own responsibility, and they'll look at their little pieces. Even in business models, you have a very specific business model for Enel or for Equinor, and you need to make returns. But that is not necessarily always the best thing for society as a whole. So bringing the story together in a better knit fashion, making sure each part of the story has the right incentives to take action is important. And I don't think we've been working that way. And I can give you an example of where I'm starting to see that happen, which is exciting. And so I think it's partly the story. It is partly the tools. I mean, what I highlighted, it is the best energy analysts today, and they keep underestimating the potential of renewable energy. They keep underestimating the potential of storage, and they're underestimating the potential of EVs. We're seeing that already starting to unfold. The markets on our EVs are moving so quickly. Car companies, Volkswagen, others, countries, we've now got 15 countries that have said that they are going to end sales of internal combustion engine vehicles in the near future. So the markets are shifting quickly, right? We're starting to see that move. And that's not always been captured in the models and the projections, and that means that we're not always making the right investments because we don't see those in the policy choices. But let me start with this one on something that's more connected with an example from actually Indonesia. Indonesia it's one of the countries that sets up 5-year economic development plans for the whole country. And they'll be coming out with, at the beginning of next year, 2020, the one for their next economic development plan for 2020 to 2024. And about a year and a half ago, President Jokowi in Indonesia said, all right, for our next one, I want it to be the first ever low carbon development plan. So he turned to his planning minister and said, all right, please make this one a low carbon one. And the planning minister set his whole team to work on this, and they came and reached out to us and many others and said, okay, how can you help? How can we identify a transition pathway which would be low carbon for Indonesia? And what they've released in March of this year is something called the Low Carbon Development Initiative for Indonesia. And they identified pathways when they looked across the economy, in the energy sector, in the transport sector, in building efficiency, in better use of land and halting deforestation. Across all of these areas, they identified specific measures they could take, which would actually lead to much greater ambition than their current climate targets under the Paris Agreement. And it would lead to better growth for Indonesia, stronger GDP growth, 6% GDP growth on average per year, starting from next year, starting from 2020, no delay. It would lead to better health outcomes, better outcomes in terms of gender disparity, in terms of regional disparity, and more jobs, right? So it's a wonderful story when they look across the economy, look at the interactions. And part of this is just realizing how much the costs of not acting hurt the Indonesian economy. Air pollution is a major challenge in Jakarta. It's probably up there now with Beijing and Delhi. So you're starting to see the impacts of continuing to burn coal, continuing to have an economy that is based more and more on individual personal transport of cars, and the costs of that are really starting to hit. So they're starting to see that. They're starting to see the costs of resource depletion and resource degradation and what that means for lower agricultural yields, for example. So once you start to consider this and some of the opportunities, it gives a different picture. And one specific example on this is really around coal. So when we first started talking to them, it was very clear. Anytime you talk to the energy ministry or you talk to the energy utility, they were very clear. Look, coal was cheaper. Coal is cheaper in Indonesia than wind or solar right now. If you just take the unit cost, that is where it falls out. They realize that globally this is shifting quickly. It hasn't hit Indonesia yet, partly because they just haven't had economies of scale in solar and wind and geothermal. But right now, coal on a unit cost, just looking at that, is cheaper. And so they were saying, well, we're going to invest heavily in coal. That's where we need to go because it's going to be cheaper to start expanding access. Now, what they hadn't considered is what does this actually mean in terms of health impacts? So one of the things the Minister of Finance and Minister of Planning said was, well, that's interesting, but if you actually consider the cost of the different energy, new energy developments to the Indonesian economy more broadly, how does this look? And so one of the pieces of analysis in their low carbon development initiative was looking at air pollution costs just locally in Indonesia. So not even considering climate costs to the globe, nothing like that, just local air pollution costs in terms of health impacts in Indonesia. And even when you add in only part of these, not all of them were able to be measured, but part of these, coal is no longer cheaper for the economy. Actually, wind and solar are already today a better option than coal. Now, the energy ministry and the energy utility turned around and said, okay, that's all fine, but that's not our problem. That's the health ministry. But that's where the finance ministry and the planning ministry come in because they do care and they do need to care and be responsible for the economy as a whole. So then the finance ministry steps in and says, okay, this is actually a much better choice for us to go to renewables, not to keep building out new coal. But as a finance ministry, I need to make sure there's the right incentives in place and that we're able to help make that transition. Because on a pure energy basis, it's not there. And so you're starting to see that kind of dialogue when you look across the economy, when you involve the different ministries, and it's better for the Indonesian economy, it's better for Indonesians, the people themselves, and it's better globally. So we're starting to see that. I do think the finance sector waking up is an interesting one, and what was mentioned already on coal, it's been difficult to shift. I think that's going to start shifting now. We're seeing major banks, public and private banks, that are no longer willing to finance coal. We see some of the big insurance schemes that are no longer willing to insure coal power. I think we're going to start seeing a shift because people are waking up to the costs of the stranded asset and that there are differences. But it's true, it's not shifted yet.
Gina, you raise your hand. So.
Yes, my comment relates to realistic energy transition. And if you pick up coal and see what happened in Great Britain, Great Britain's CO2 emissions are down by 28% the last 10 years because they have shifted from coal to natural gas and to renewables. And natural gas is the perfect backup to renewables. Today, when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, you need a backup energy source. So gas is actually a critical part of the reduction in CO2 emissions in the UK. Also, Great Britain is a good example of what incentives are needed to boost the energy transition. And they are about to quadruple their investments in renewable energy right now. And they have incentives, especially when the technology is new and immature. They have higher incentives. That's why Equinor has built an offshore wind farm in the UK, because the incentives were better than anywhere else. And I would urge governments to be willing to help corporations and projects, innovation, R&D in an initial phase. And eventually, history tells us that technologies will be less dependent on incentives. Projects might even be profitable. And we need to build scale that would also help the economy. So look to Britain. Also, if I may share one example of a creative partnership between governments and corporations and innovation communities. 2 weeks ago, we made an investment decision to build the world's first project where we take 2 oil and gas installations in the North Sea, and we will power them from a wind farm. We could never have done that without incentives from the Norwegian government and R&D efforts. I find that as a very inspiring story, since we are at a place now where these projects are not profitable.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing up the UK, because I think one of the things that fascinates me about the UK is besides their switch towards gas and renewable energy, you've also seen a huge decline in energy consumption. We had a question earlier on about energy efficiency and how you get to that. So maybe Sandra, I'll come to you at some point for some thoughts of that. But I wanted to take a slight detour a little bit because you brought up Indonesia, and so I wanted to bring in Johannes to give us a sense from an energy poverty perspective, because one of the challenges when you step back big picture is, there's some people in this world that have to consume a lot less energy and maybe different types of energy, but then there's a lot of people in this world that are nowhere near having. You talked a little bit about, as you move towards, basic energy, towards getting your refrigerator, getting your air conditioner. So maybe give us a sense a little bit of where we are on the energy poverty and access conversation.
Okay. So if we look at the energy access situation, we have, as usual, we have some good news and we have some bad news. The good news is that the number of people without any electricity access at all has decreased significantly. We now have, for the first time in a long, long time, fewer than 1 billion people without electricity at home. So that's quite a major achievement, and a lot of the credit should go to India, which has reduced that number by 200 million in the last 2 years alone. So that's a pretty impressive accomplishment. But the challenge with this is that if you look at what that kind of electricity access means, it's typically lights and mobile phone. We are not talking about computers, we are not talking about freezers, we are not talking about productive appliances. So I think energy poverty is a bigger challenge if you start thinking of kind of modern energy with large industry, commercial services, mobility, and things like this, instead of just kind of minimum access. The other major challenge is cooking. So in cooking, we are not making really any progress at all. We have the same number of people who are using traditional biomass. There are still, over 3 billion people who primarily cook with traditional biomass, and that is very bad for your health, because if you do it inside, you are, breathing completely unacceptable air. Really, it's the air quality inside is so terrible. So I think energy access is a big challenge, but I do see over time, in the medium run, the bigger challenge is really going to be in energy consumption rather than just access. So I think we will be able to solve these connection problems, and I think we will, in the next 10 years, be in a situation where over 90% of the world will have electricity at home. But when will we be in a situation where everybody has access to the kind of energy they need to lead a kind of convenient, safe, productive life? That's going to be a much more difficult challenge, because then our energy demand either has to skyrocket, or then our efficiency needs to kind of reach a much higher level than where we are today.
Can I do a follow-up? Because I know you've written about this. What explains the difference in success on electricity access versus cooking? Why can we make so much more progress on electricity and so much less on cooking?
I think there's a few different reasons. The first one is just very simple physical. So having electricity access, you basically need a wire. And if the government gets to the point where they're able to install poles and draw wires, you're done. Okay? Whereas cooking is much more challenging, because cooking takes very large amounts of energy. So creating a kind of distribution network and making clean cooking fuel affordable is very difficult. So that's reason number one. The second one is political. Electricity seems to be a kind of topic that everybody finds exciting. Well, okay, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but in this room, you get my point. So if you ask almost anybody in the world, would you like to have electricity, and can you think of ways to use it? Anybody, no matter whether they have any education at all, whether they can read or write or anything, they can think of 20 different things to do with that electricity. Clean cooking fuels, you go to somebody who cooks with traditional biomass, has primary education, and say, would you be interested in paying a lot of money to have clean cooking fuels? They said, I really don't understand what you're trying to do here. So electricity is a topic no government can afford to ignore it. In the Brazilian constitution, it says that every Brazilian needs to have electricity at home. On the other hand, if you look at clean cooking fuels, it is mostly being ignored by politicians. So I think that's another very important reason for this.
You wanted to jump in, or?
At some point, as usual, you were encouraging us to
Especially if you're
slightly
trying to
disagree.
Yeah, so if you're just going to say, I agree with Johannes, no.
No, I was actually going to disagree a little bit with something that Gina said and something Johannes said earlier, if I can.
Disagreement, you can always jump in.
Like
If you're just going to agree, no.
Sorry. It's on this question of the role of gas as a transition fuel, which we've been talking about for a while. And I do think the UK story is incredibly interesting in terms of rapidly shifting away from coal to gas to actually reduce emissions. I think the problem is we've talked about gas as a transition, a bridge, right, to get to renewables for a long time. What we've never talked about is where's the end of the bridge? How soon is it? And what are the guardrails to make sure that we're actually not slipping off the side? And some of the guardrails are around methane emissions, which have been a much bigger issue in gas than I think many realized. And the end of the bridge, and what is our transition off the bridge to get onto the renewables path? And I think that's coming more quickly than many people think. And I think what we're seeing is that there's so much focus on the importance of gas as a transition that people are investing in more gas, more development of gas, the pipelines, the exploration, rather than focusing that investment on renewables. And so I do want to challenge us a little bit, and back to a point that Johannes made. I mean, the challenge around renewable energy, scaling renewable energy, is around variability. But actually, we are seeing developments around storage technology, including storage that can be longer term. We're seeing that right now, where we are in terms of renewables integration in the grid, in most countries is so far from where we'd actually get limits that it's really not an issue that we need to be focusing on. So I think if we could actually shift the focus to getting more into the grid, more storage capacity. The example you gave of India was an interesting one. I mean, the peak power was 10 p.m. at night. I think that's what I've heard as well. And of course, you don't have the sun shining there. But if you start combining that with a massive dissemination of electric vehicles and uptake of electric vehicles, if those electric vehicles are plugged into the grid, at night you actually then have a broader grid through the EVs and what they're storing, which can help with that. Similarly, on energy efficiency, I think we're seeing new technologies and developments where you can also run your equipment, whether it's washing machines or others, at times of day when you have peak power available rather than peak demand. So I think we're actually getting towards a lot more of these solutions. I think we're actually still very far from facing challenges with the integration into the grid. I think we've got the technological solutions to do that for quite a ways still. And focusing on those rather than more exploration at the moment of fossil fuels is, to me, the direction we need to go for this energy transition. And I just remind you, we have, at the moment, hundreds of billions of dollars that are being invested in fossil fuel exploration and development. Sorry, government public funds, tax breaks and subsidies to exploration, development, and use of fossil fuels. Is that really where we want to be putting public money, or should it be in solving the issues around the integration and the storage?
I cannot resist my role of former teacher of a gas class here at SAIS. But the thing I wanted to put on the table, I always find the discussions around gas fascinating because it's one of those things that if you solve the near-term problem, you can use gas. Then at some point, you know, gas is then the emitter, and so you go after gas. But the thing I wanted, and maybe you can think about it if you want to jump in, the challenge is usually when people oppose gas, they focus on power generation, but don't have a lot to say about commercial, residential, and industry, which is actually a much bigger challenge. So I'd love to maybe come to that. But Sandra, I wanted to come to you, and there's a couple of things that I wanted to see if you could tackle for us. One is this idea of business models, and in particular, I'm listening to your example, Helen, of the electric vehicles in India balancing the grid. I mean, that's going to take a little bit of a business model innovation, putting aside systems management to get there. But I also wanted to get your reaction to something that Gina said, that we invest where there are incentives. So maybe walk a little bit. Are we at the point where these technologies, especially the more established ones, don't really need government support anymore? What are the areas where we still need sort of the public sector? I mean, one of the things that strikes me when I look at the IEA numbers, that they do a tally of how much investment is happening in renewable energy, what they see is that over 70% has some kind of public guarantee, whether it's a PPA or whether it's a, an auction, whether it's a feed-in tariff. The role of the public sector is still quite vital. So maybe those kind of two really tiny questions of business models and government support, if you can, address those in like a minute or something.
Yeah, sure. So if we've got the rest of the day, that works. That works. Then we can finish it up maybe tomorrow and over the next couple weeks. So two questions there. I think it's a really interesting, to build on Helen and Gina's points there. I think where the short answer about the incentives and market drivers is that it sort of depends. I think one interesting aspect of NL's business that we've seen and to build on a lot of this is we're building projects where we see demand for projects, right? And so that's an interesting and loaded statement. There are two features there. One is that you're absolutely right. There are places now in the world where wind and solar are absolutely, if not competitive, then can beat their thermal alternatives. And there are two aspects of that. And one is that we're building projects there, most certainly. And then two, it's a level of communication. Is that and then I'll come back to that in a second. Where we're seeing a lot, I think when I started at NL 7 years ago, most of our business was in utility PPA. So we were, in the United States and elsewhere, we were responding to a feed-in tariff, we were responding to a renewable portfolio standard requirement, we're responding to various sort of public or government market requests for renewables. So a utility had to go out and procure X number of gigawatt hours of renewable energy. We were there to build the wind energy farm to support that. Over the last, really accelerating over the last few years, the balance of private party PPA that we've been signing, or public PPA versus private party PPA has changed. So, the drivers of our growth right now are not necessarily, they are to some degree utilities and governments, but they are increasingly, especially in places like the United States, private industry. Yeah. We're seeing this as a priority. And there are two aspects to this. One is that they're seeing it as a priority for their own sustainability reasons, right? So, we found an enormous partner with AB InBev. So, it's as a side note, this was the first time I've been able to describe to my mother exactly what I do for a living. It was like, see, Budweiser needs renewable energy for their beer production. You see the beer; it has a battery on it. We make that energy, and it comes together. And like light bulbs go off, light dawns over Marblehead, and Christmas becomes acceptable again. Take that, Dr. Cohan. The second part, but the issue there more so is that on one side they're asking for it for their sustainability reasons. The second part about it is that as we get into conversations with private industry, we're showing that you can achieve these sustainability goals with the same economic vectors as thermal energy, that it actually does make sense and it actually gets more sophisticated. So the first answer to your question is that you're starting to see certain pockets of the environment where you don't necessarily need a production tax credit. And to that end, we're supportive of a measured drawdown to the PTC in the U.S., right? That said, of course, there are other ways that, there is a process of market transformation that needs to happen. You certainly can't just decide to stop using natural gas, but you certainly can create the market conditions where you move away from natural gas and you support an alternative marketplace that can provide the same value, right? Same valuable electron, the same value of an electron to a community without the negative externality, or at a greater value. So there's a number of ways you can do it. And so we certainly support policy and market mechanisms that allow us to create different values, whether that is a carbon price or a cap and trade system, where you can value the environmental impact of a specific electron. Or it's places where you can start thinking about ways where customers cannot just be consumers of an electricity grid and and passive participants in a retail grid where power is generated some far off place and you buy the electron for a certain price, but you're actually operating in a back and forth network. So you're starting to see more, support for more technologies that allow you to participate in vehicle to grid technology. So your house becomes an active and participatory member in in an electricity grid. And that's sort of how you start shifting mindset and shifting framework towards decarbonization.
Gina, you raised your hand, but I wanted to maybe also ask you a question, and then I'm going to come to you. So please have your questions ready. Because one of the things I wanted to ask you before was this tension between, you're doing all the things that you said, CCS and offshore wind, but you're still investing in oil and gas. So trying to think about, how do you balance those two things as you look into the future? So maybe if you can also kind of address a little bit of that, and then we'll come to the audience.
I expected that question, actually. Sometimes I find the discussions somewhat binary. Either you are pro or against oil and gas or offshore wind, whatever. But that leads me back to my point. What is a realistic energy transition? Yeah. And again, today the energy mix, 80% is coal, oil, and gas. 80%. It has been constant for 30 years. And renewables is not there yet. But my comment, why I raised my hand, is that on incentives. It's very encouraging to see that offshore wind projects today in Europe is actually commercial. Yeah. The challenge for us today is to win the bids. And that has happened in a very short time period. So it matters, and we need incentives as a kickstarter. But all projects must be commercial, also CCS. That's why we are putting a lot of emphasis on finding a new business model to make CCS commercial in the long run. And the governments must be a partner in the beginning, but eventually it must be commercial.
Thank you. The reason I think Gina keeps coming back to realistic is, Equinor is one of the companies that puts out a long-term outlook. It's called Energy Perspectives. We have the privilege of hosting Equinor at CSIS, and Eric Varnes, who's the chief economist of Equinor. When you hear him describe what it takes to get to a 2-degree, forget 1.5-degree world, you don't come away from the meeting thinking, we're going to get there anytime soon, right? So I think that's kind of my color commentary about why the word realistic keeps coming up. Because I think the challenge is immense.
And I think to that end, to the offshore wind question, I think offshore wind is of course a really necessary part about that. But you are seeing, a really big gap, and this is where technology also comes into play. Really big gap between where a company like Equinor needs to be to meet the contract requirements of I don't recall when Empire Wind needs to have turbines in the water, but it's 5 years from now, versus where we are in the technology today, right? And how do you so it goes back from not just sort of market technology, but also R&D incentives to push the commercialization pipeline so that you can actually hit those targets and having realistic price assumptions.
I agree.
Super. Okay, so why don't you guys put up your hands so I can see what the demand is for questions. Okay. So since we don't have a tremendous amount of time, what I'll do is I say 3 questions on this side, so we'll take all 3 and give a batch, and then maybe come to this side later. So very simple rule, wait for the microphone. Start with the gentleman in the back, and just please state your name, question in the form of a question.
Gabriel Weil, Climate Leadership Council. Just wanted to know, particularly for the lady from Equinor, what carbon price level do you think would be necessary to make CCS commercially at scale viable, and do you expect that to go down over time?
Perfect. And then there was a question right there. We can take 3 at one batch. So, yeah,
Please, the microphone.
Yeah, you can take the
Hi, my name is Jamie, student here at SAIS. I have 2 questions. The first one for Helen. You spoke about sort of being ambitious and some sectors focusing on carbon neutral goals. But to achieve that kind of goal, are there pockets of opportunities that are financially viable that could be potentially carbon negative in terms of overall, carbon emission? And second question is to our panelists working on the power supply side. Nico kind of already touched upon this in terms of that dynamic between profitability and transition. And my question pertains to the expertise. How do we envision, sort of creating the expertise necessary for traditional oil and gas companies to be able to better analyze opportunities in the renewable space?
Okay, well, since we got 3 questions through 2 speakers, we can do this first batch, and then we'll come back to the audience.
Yeah. I don't have a good answer to that. It's complex, and it depends where you are and what projects you are involved in. In Europe, we have a price on carbon. We have the ETS system. So when we look at the commercial CCS in Europe, it's very different from the US. Here, you don't have a price on carbon. In Equinor, our assumption is that overall, we will have to spend more money to pay for carbon emissions, and we take that into consideration when we look at our investment decisions.
Okay. Helen, you want to?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, we are actually seeing a number of sectors and companies across a number of sectors really aiming for carbon neutrality now. I think that was something that was big that came out of the UN Climate Action Summit last month in New York. We now have 92 companies, major companies like IKEA, L'Oreal, a number of others with 4.2 million employees globally, which have committed to pathways which are aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we've got a lot that are starting to step forward. We are seeing in many cases there are business models which are starting to be economically profitable, or often they will require further investments upfront, but will actually deliver better returns, and they're starting to see those. I think in terms of where we see the most financial viability for sort of net negative emissions, I mean, one is what you might do in terms of carbon capture, utilization, and storage in the future, and I think what Gina mentioned in Norway, they're really looking at the cutting edge of how can you use carbon emissions and store them in a permanent way, which could actually lead to benefits, and how to bring down the costs of that. There's starting to be some really exciting developments around direct air capture even. And then probably the best potential out there is in land use, right? In terms of planting trees or better having a soil which can actually absorb carbon. The potential is enormous there from some often fairly simple and easy to do practices, but we're just not using them enough. So that is an area where a lot of the discussions on net neutral emissions or net zero emissions are really looking to what we can do in the land use space. In some cases, I'd say actually betting too much on that, because we still do need land to feed people, a growing population with more, we need land for our own use as humans, and we need it for ecosystems. So we still do need that, but that is an area where there's definitely some really exciting developments and potential economic returns.
Perfect. Let's do one more round. Gentleman up here.
Hi, my name's Jake Stockman, student here in ERE. My question is, anticipating the need for infrastructure for carbon capture, electric vehicle charging, even conventional transmission lines, we already have a huge funding gap in terms of infrastructure globally and in the United States. So I'm curious how this infrastructure is going to get built and whether that will be done sustainably. Thank you.
Perfect. Right there for the second person, the back. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi there, Kayvon from the Canadian Embassy. There's some concern out there that we are pursuing decarbonization at the expense of the environment. Could you kind of discuss some of the third scope knock-on impacts of new energy sources like wind, like solar, and how we overcome some of those challenges? For example, sourcing enough lithium for battery storage and energy, which is all very important, but just how we mitigate some of those third scope impacts.
Perfect. And then the lady.
Hi, my name's Karen Riechenberg. I'm a former student, also on the ERE program. My question is about an energy source which, from my observation, almost never gets discussed in these type of discussions, and that is nuclear energy. For obvious reasons, there are a lot of issues with it, and it's become a bit of a taboo theme. I would like to know from each panelist, do you think that nuclear energy should play a bigger role in the energy transition? Yes or no, and why or why not?
Excellent, simple questions. Paying for infrastructure, nuclear energy, and second and third order effects like lithium. Thankfully, nothing was addressed by anyone in particular, so you can dodge things very easily. But maybe start from the far end and make our way back, and then you can answer to whatever question you think most qualified to answer. Or pass.
Forecast.
Or pass.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. I think I would like to wait for a second.
Okay.
We are not involved in nuclear energy, so I need to think about your question.
I'll go bottom up then. Yes, and we have some nuclear assets. We have no plans to expand our nuclear assets as far as I know. The issue with nuclear, I think, with fission, is the cost of building one, the cost of maintaining it, the cost of safety, the potential for disaster, and the cost of preventing disaster greatly outweigh the benefits that it would provide. So we would prefer to focus our research dollars on solving the zero carbon, the renewables problem rather than the nuclear problem. I think there are, I think fusion, if and when it comes around, will be very interesting. But I think that's another panel discussion. Going back up to a quick thing, land use. So that's a really big question. We think about this a lot at NL, especially as we start building more. It's an issue. It's something we're thinking about in terms of, as I said, we have active topics right now in land use. To build on Helen's last point, we see a really interesting piece of work in the energy agriculture nexus. So how do we improve the land use impact of our renewable energy facilities? So combining solar and wind with agriculture. And there's a lot of really fascinating research emerging in that. How do you use more marginal land for renewable energy production rather than prime farmland? On the toxicity front, absolutely. So we are looking to move away from toxic materials in our renewable energy plants. So certainly, cadmium, things like that, XXX toxic work that doesn't benefit us in the long run. And we have open innovation calls. So we are internally and externally looking for ways to improve the recyclability. So for example, believe it or not, we're at the end stage of a cycle of wind turbines. We're starting to actually now take down old wind farms and build new ones on the sites. What do you do with all that fiberglass? We haven't found a really great solution yet to solve fiberglass recycling or second life batteries. And so this is something that as we expand renewables, it's something we'll certainly have to address. And I'll punt on the infrastructure question because that's a long conversation. I'll move on to the rest of the guys.
I'll try and briefly to discuss infrastructure and nuclear, but just very briefly. On infrastructure, again, there's a good news and a bad news story here. An assessment that we did in the New Climate Economy a number of years ago found that if you actually look at what investment we need in infrastructure between now and 2030, it's something like $90 trillion in infrastructure to achieve our development goals and what we're trying to achieve economically. And it's about the same if you do that in a low carbon way. So the good news is that actually it doesn't need to cost much more, right? And in fact, you will get, as we've already discussed, some benefits and returns through more efficiency gains or less cost for exploration, more compact cities, for example, which really get some important economic gains. The bad news is we're nowhere near the level of investment each year we need to actually reach that. Whether it's low carbon or not, we're not there yet. What we're seeing is there is a lot of movement now, and if you look at some of the multilateral development banks here in DC, the World Bank, IFC, IADB, just to name a few, but also overseas, some of the multilateral and regional development banks. Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a particularly notable example that's been developed for we've got the BRICS New Development Bank. We're actually starting to see a real emphasis on how we can use a limited amount of public finance to actually leverage more private finance into infrastructure. And increasingly, these development banks, regional, national, international, are recognizing the importance of doing it in a way which is low carbon and climate resilient. So they're looking at, they've got a number of tools that they're starting to use to help lower the risks, which basically increases the risk return profile for private investors, to find ways that they can actually attract private investment into infrastructure. I think one of the most promising and interesting areas is probably what will happen with institutional investors, pension funds and others. Strictly speaking, pension funds should be a perfect match for long-term infrastructure investments. Right? You've got a long-term profile of when you get the returns over time. Because of various regulations and approaches in place today, they're not being used that way. So there's a big push now amongst pension funds themselves and with regulators to look at how we can make this match work to get that infrastructure investment needed. So that's on the infrastructure side. We're definitely not there yet. Good news is, can do it low carbon and climate resilient for the same amount of investment, but we need to get that investment flowing. On nuclear, I mean, we do, there's a range of different options out there to go low carbon, and we try not to take any off the table. We want to keep the range open to look at what potential there is going forward. I would have to agree very much with Sander on nuclear at the moment. If you actually run the economics of the cost of building nuclear, it's not obvious that you would want to expand nuclear when you've got other opportunities, renewables, including now offshore wind, but solar, wind, geothermal, which are so much more cost competitive. So it's just not economically something which looks like we need it right now.
So on infrastructure, I think the biggest challenge is going to be that the greatest need for infrastructure is in countries that don't have a great enabling environment for infrastructure. So in India, which is a kind of a middle, okay, but not great environment, finance is already by far the highest cost for renewable energy. And India is much better than, for example, African countries. So those countries are really going to face a big challenge. On the environmental impacts of renewable energy and all that, here I think my colleague Sarah Jordan, who is as the expert in life cycle assessment, will be much more qualified to answer this question than I am. But my understanding is that these issues have reached a kind of serious level in case of biofuels when they've been using kind of old technology without the regulations. I think in case of renewables, we need to be careful and kind of have the same environmental impact system as with everything else. But I think overall, it's still a no-brainer that it's better than coal, for example. Finally, on nuclear, I'd like to kind of think about this from a technology-neutral perspective. If somebody can build a nuclear power plant and deal with the insurance issues, with the waste issues at a cost that beats renewables and gas and all that, then that's wonderful. I think today in most places that is very hard to do. So I think what we need to do is we need to give the nuclear industry a fair chance to play the game and then see if they can meet the challenge or not. But I don't think there's any need to be kind of like specifically pro-nuclear. The key thing is just to have a carbon price or some other policy, and then let's see who is able to win the bid.
The one thing, if I can take the moderator's prerogative to add on nuclear, I always think of the distinction between existing and new nuclear.
Yeah, that's very important.
One of the things that we've noticed on the global level is that basically once you take off nuclear power in Japan and Germany, you've kind of offset a big chunk of the renewable energy that we've got in the world, right? So new nuclear is uneconomic in most parts of the world. Finding a way to keep existing nuclear going might be a slightly different conversation. So I just hope that people separate those two things out when they talk about nuclear. Can you raise your hand?
Yes, a short comment on nuclear. Why aren't we involved in nuclear? Well, Norway has no history on it, and neither has we as a company. But to succeed in the energy transition, you need to pick where you actually have something to add, where you have competencies, where you can see synergies. And for us, there are many synergies between oil and gas projects and offshore wind projects. So that's why we have picked offshore wind and CCS and hydrogen as our main pathways towards a more renewable future.
Perfect. Well, I am mindful that we are standing between you and some really delicious things back there. So what I want to do is I just wanted to ask you to join me in thanking this great panel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of your time here. I think it's going to be a fantastic session this afternoon. We'll be focusing specifically on the U.S. energy transition in this model. I'm delighted to be here with a number of highly distinguished panelists. So we truly have a rich diversity of perspectives which highlights the interdisciplinary nature of both the challenges as well as the solutions related to our energy systems and sustainability. So we'll be discussing the critical nature of U.S. leadership in this transition. I'll give a quick introduction to the speakers, and then we will have a moderated discussion followed by Q&A. First, we have Professor Vicky Arroyo, who is Executive Director of Georgetown Climate Center. She also serves as Assistant Dean for Centers and Institute and Professor of Practice at Georgetown University Law Center. The really interesting thing and critical thing about her career that will be an excellent contribution to this panel is that she has a wealth of experience combining advising politicians, government agencies, as well as actually practicing law. In addition, she's held a number of prestigious professional positions, such as Vice President of Policy Analysis and General Counsel at the Pew Center on Climate Change. She has academic degrees in science, biology, as well as an MPA from the Kennedy School, and JD from Georgetown Law, magna cum laude. We also have Dr. Joseph Mikett. He is, the exciting thing about him being on this panel is that we have a very distinguished scientist who actively works on education on Capitol Hill. So that is something that's critical and extremely important, clearly in this day and age particularly. He is the Director of Climate Policy at the Niskanen Center. He's an expert in climate science, climate policy, risk and uncertainty, so very important for our transition. Before Niskanen, he was a Congressional Science Fellow, and he holds a PhD in Princeton University in Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences, a master's degree in mathematics from Delphi University, and a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Harvey Mudd College, which is really fantastic, so a robust experience in the quantitative side as well. We also have a practitioner, so Catherine Gensler. She's the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the Solar Energy Industries Association. So she brings to us the practitioner's perspective. She's out there lobbying the administration in support of solar energy policies. I know all you SCICE students are interested in the economic component, so that includes taxes, financing issues, siting, transmission grid policies. She leads advocacy work in Texas, leveraging the experience that she gained working at FERC, and also from her master's degree in public affairs and a bachelor in political science from Indiana University and University of Wisconsin. So all of you out there who are more on the political science side will have that experience as well. And by the way, she walks the walk because she lives in a solar-powered home in Capitol Hill. Okay. Then finally, last but not least, we have an academic, another academic. So Professor Leah Stokes is joining us from the Department of Political Science at University of California, Santa Barbara. She also has, so true interdisciplinarian as well, so she also has affiliations with the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and Environmental Studies. The great part of her being on this panel is that she looks at both American politics in her scholarly pursuits in addition to environmental politics, okay? So on the environmental side, she looks at everything from public opinion voting behavior, but also public policy, and she looks at the state level as well, which we know is of critical importance, and I suspect will come up in our panel today because there's some very exciting new matters that are arising. Further, she actively engages media from everything from New York Times, and she has some very impressive publications in Nature Journal, Energy Policy, Environmental Science and Technology, really highlighting her background, academic background from a PhD master's degree from MIT, Political Science and Urban Studies, and also an MPA from Columbia. So I am not going to take up any more time. I could probably spend half the panel talking about how great the panel is. So before I do that, I'm going to start by just kicking off with asking for comments on the key questions that we're going to be addressing today, starting with Professor Vicky Arroyo. So the first question is, there's a couple of questions, so you can pick and choose what aspects of these questions you want to start with, but what are the policy approaches that we have to achieve an effective and just transition? How can competing visions be reconciled? Okay, we know that's a big political challenge here in the US. And also bridging our first panel on global issues, are there lessons globally that can be applied here in the US? So Vicki, would you like to start?
Sure. So thank you for being here, and thank you all for being here in the beautiful weather that we're having outside, and after a late night for many of us, I think, watching the Nats game. So transition, of course, is inevitable, and it's happening. It's just a matter of whether or not we will try to make our policies just or not. And I've come at this largely over the years working at the Pew Center on Climate Change for 10 years, and then more recently this center at Georgetown, which focuses largely at the state level on trying to effectuate policy that moves the needle on the emission side, but realizing that we've really evolved in our ways of having conversations about this from thinking that some kind of a top-down, Pareto optimal approach to policy will necessarily get us there if we don't have the buy-in of the public. And so I've seen that evolution in my career, in part because it's been a lot harder for us who've been working on climate policy to really get that policy in place at the federal level, where there were bills over the years, and I've been working on this since there was the very first big comprehensive, cap and trade kind of bills like McCain-Lieberman that got even more big and comprehensive with Waxman, Markey, ACES later, that had this element of a just transition. We've seen, presidential candidates in the past and currently talking about that aspect of a transition with their climate policy, which I think is really important. And I think we're seeing even more of a push given the Green New Deal and Greta and all the, Sunrise Movement and the new energy around it, raising all these questions about equity, about the people most adversely affected by climate impacts, but also about how do you transition. And I think for the most part, this conversation has come up in the context of the coal sector. And so I've looked into, some examples from states and looked into this example in Centralia in Washington State, which had a coal mine that was facing closure and did take some steps to help the folks that lost 600 jobs there, and in anticipation of even further job loss as they shift from coal power overall because of the new bills that have been passed that are really trying to get us out of the business of coal. And so in that case, they have spent or identified $55 million to be used to weatherize homes and school and government buildings, paying for new college programs, power plant employees who are looking to retrain can get money for themselves or even transfer that money to a spouse who might train. There's now an industrial park with some new employees, even though the mine closed, and there has been some shift to renewable energy. And I think a lot of times we think about this, and I'm from Louisiana, which is an energy producing state. I've worked in Charleston, West Virginia on pollution issues, more of a coal kind of state. And I think generally people are trying to think about how do you make a transition from people in the energy sector to the energy sector, and sometimes that can happen. But I think more broadly, there are other things to think about, like, from electric power utilities to water utilities that are wrestling with the impacts of more stormwater management and getting training on resilience. So job training, really across sectors, I think is something that we should look into. And I think we should be aware of the fact that other sectors like the automobile industry is going to go through some dramatic changes. I drive a Bolt, an EV, I love it. So whether or not we actually succeed, as some people would like, in moving towards more autonomous vehicles, even electric vehicles, I think, are not necessarily popular for the dealers to sell. I had to go to another state to buy mine. Because I think, part of it is that they don't make as much money from the parts and the labor associated with it. So, there's transitions in a lot of these industries as we move from fossil fuel to cleaner sources of energy. And we need to understand that and try to incorporate that into our policy making. I think personally that price signals matter and markets matter. And one of the things that we've done at the Climate Center that I lead is to work with the states in this region from DC all the way up to Maine in something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative that has very open, transparent process that's been going on now for some years with an open portal for comments right now. We've had 1,000 people this year show up at big public events throughout the region that are regional. States themselves in the region are having events with stakeholders, including some of the affected industries, but also environmental justice groups and voices like that. The idea is to have a market, a cap and invest program for transportation similar to what we have in this region for the power sector with RGGI. And I think that by generating those funds, you're not only creating that price signal, but you're also having funds that you can then invest in the community, including perhaps in a just transition, as well as in communities that are already disproportionately affected by pollution or underserved currently. So one of the bits of news that Sarah was mentioning was that I was just telling her about the California lawsuit. Of course, California also has a cap and trade program that I had the privilege of, in the early days of the Schwarzenegger administration's setting that up, of serving on an advisory committee to CARB. And now the Department of Justice in the Trump era is attacking California's leadership and their linkage with the Quebec system in a filing before U.S. District Court in the Eastern District of California, which I think is very unfortunate because we've already been working with states on a bipartisan basis to fight some of the federal rollbacks of things that we've all worked very hard on, including the Clean Power Plan, the car standards, California's waiver authority. And this is just another attack really on state leadership in an era of dismantling our federal policies that are aimed at climate change. So it's very unfortunate, and happy to talk more about that later.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you very much for your comments and perspective. And I already have questions. I'm sure the audience does as well. Joseph?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Just a brief introduction of myself and the Niskanen Center. We're a think tank here in town. We work almost exclusively on federal policy, so I only know enough about state level policies to get myself in a lot of trouble. But I do think there's a couple things I would add to the conversation a little bit. I mean, the models I think for climate policy are relatively well known, right? We can pursue market mechanisms, we can pursue mandate-based regulatory structures, and generally I find that when we're having conversations around what climate policy should look like, justice and equity concerns do have a real voice at the table, right? In my most direct experience has been with a set of carbon pricing bills that have been introduced over the last couple of years. I think there's like now 6 or 7 floating around Congress. One of the concerns about carbon pricing, by way of introduction, is by raising energy prices, you're unfairly burdening poor people or low-income communities, or perhaps you're going to put coal communities out of business, and what are we supposed to do about them? In almost every case, I find that there are concessions or mechanisms in the policies that are being discussed and designed which attempt to offset the costs for lower income people of higher energy prices or the costs of the energy transition. And likewise, there are usually provisions to try and offset some of the costs for communities, either like directly by helping municipalities that are going to lose excise tax income, or by doing job training programs, or by making investments in what are going to be cleaner energies that have specific geographical attributes. Like, for instance, supporting carbon capture and storage technologies, which are going to be located in particular areas, generally benefiting rural places, et cetera. So I think these things usually, there's a ton of mechanisms. And I think what we've seen out of the state policy, or what I get encouraged seeing out of state policy, is they kind of work, right? So if you look at the California example, which is the one I'm most familiar with, there you have a carbon pricing system that's supposed to work fairly comprehensively. It's getting better and better with time, kind of resolving early design challenges and some economic speed bumps around 2008. But what you see is that when you raise carbon revenue, you can use the money to do efficiency programs, you can use the money to help people in smart housing programs. And so a lot of our sort of fears about even aggressive climate policies, disturbing low-income people or disturbing low-income communities, can be addressed. I think it's a really interesting question to ask ourselves critically, is that working as well as it can? And it's an interesting question to think about. How do we need to think about that question at the federal level? I'm going to completely punt on the international level because I think there's a rich set of interesting ideas around what we do around for development and what we do in developing countries versus developed countries. And it's just not a place where I'm got deep bench knowledge.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Catherine?
Hello, everyone. Let me start with a disclaimer that while I certainly am here with a lot of knowledge from my time at the Solar Energy Industries Association, for those of you who are live tweeting this event, these are personal comments, not the views of my organization. Please don't get me fired today. But I've been there for about 12 years, so I have really seen the explosive growth of the solar industry in the United States. I am really happy to say that we are absolutely the solution as we transition to a decarbonized energy economy. In addition, we also think about these issues, not just of deploying fastest, cheapest, but what does a just transition look like? How does the solar industry fit into that picture? So for a little bit of background, we currently employ about 250,000 Americans in the US solar industry. If we are going to expand the industry and on the trajectory that we have predicted, that number is going to grow to about 600,000 Americans by the end of the next decade, so by 2030. That means there's a lot of jobs available. Now, do we maybe have a geographic mismatch between where existing energy jobs are and what those future jobs look like? Potentially. So this is not a one-for-one transition at this stage, but there are a lot of opportunities. Our members right now, especially for the installers, whether that's a rooftop installer or a utility scale developer, whoever is there to literally attach the equipment to another piece, those jobs are in high demand. They are, of course, outdoors, even when it's raining. They work construction hours. That means 7 a.m. They are often in remote locations, so you might have a 100-mile commute. So not everybody's willing to sign up for that job. Jobs are open in the solar industry right now, especially those on-the-ground jobs. And part of what our companies are doing is really investing in workforce development and workforce training. Most companies have their own internal training program. They don't expect to get employees who have been trained with their technology and their system and their processes. So sort of the first few weeks you're on the job, you are learning the new system. In addition, at a more systematic approach, we've got companies who have banded together and collaborated with like a local community college in order to fund a solar technician kind of program so that the baseline education is coming out. You can, sort of, it's a certification, right? It's 3 to 6 months. It's not 2 years worth of a time commitment. And by doing that locally in the area in which a large amount of solar development is expected, they're cultivating a workforce and really helping themselves to find and source local employees rather than asking somebody to spend 6 months away from their family or to do the 100-mile commute. So there are programs in place specifically geared at workforce development. In addition, we spend a lot of time thinking about solar adoption by low and moderate income populations, LMI for short. 20 years ago, when solar was more expensive than pretty much anything else you might buy other than your house, it was certainly, first adopters tended to be in upper income brackets. These days, costs have plummeted by more than 75%. So there are more affordable options for consumers. In addition, structuring programs like community solar so that you don't have to own a rooftop in order to have access to solar electrons, so that you can make a short-term 1-year or 2-year decision about your solar usage rather than a 20-year decision about your solar usage. Making sure that localities and states have community options and that you are not sort of, in the singular model of being a homeowner with your own rooftop and you're going to finance your own system. Those developments that have come both from the financing and the policy angle have helped to expand the universe of potential solar customers beyond where we started.
Yeah, and really highlighting, you know, the new job openings as part of potentially, if we can manage it well, a just transition, right? So, Leah, would you like to start with your comments?
Yeah, so I made a couple slides. Let's see if they work. No. To be determined. Oh. Well, I will just start talking. I'm an assistant professor at UC Santa Barbara, and I work on, oh, there we go. I'm going to tell you about the U.S. energy transition. There we go. So I actually work primarily at the federal level. This is for Joe. It's upon
I'm really
request,
excited that
my
you have
images.
this.
This has been called the narwhal graph, and somebody actually texted me that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which you can imagine doesn't actually agree with my views, has been using it, so kind of funny. Anyway, this is a figure which shows you the challenge, and so I actually work primarily at the state level. Like, I know a lot about California's RPS and Texas and blah, 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 but I've been thinking a lot about how do you scale this up, because if you only think about the state level, you are not winning. I don't know how much you know this, but there are states like Florida that only get 15% of its electricity right now from clean electricity sources. Ohio only gets 5% from renewables, and for those of you following, Ohio just bailed out 3 major coal plants in its state. Very disturbing. If you want to know how much money that is over the lifetime of those plants, the OVEC plants, it's like $5 billion. So it's really insane and terrible policy. Anyway, so you can't just play at the state level if you want to address this problem. And I've been thinking a lot about what I think Sunrise and Greta have been so brilliant at doing, which is reminding us that the goal is not to pass the laws that are possible, but actually to solve the problem. And so we have to think about the scale of the problem and how we're going to solve this. So the Inslee plan came up with this target of 2035 to decarbonize both the electricity and the transportation sector, and that has since been adopted by Senator Warren's campaign. And this figure just gives you a sense of what that looks like. So in 2018, we had about 36% of our electricity system coming from clean energy sources. That's nuclear, wind and solar, biomass, geothermal, et cetera, and hydro. Now, of course, for those of you who know, you cannot build new hydro. Like, there's very little new hydro. The most we could maybe do is 5 percentage points additional. So it's very little. Nuclear, as we've already talked about, is totally stalled. So what we have to do is scale up renewables at a pace that's kind of unprecedented. And why do I have it to 200 percentage points? Why? This is the professor asking you a question. Anybody know? Yes. No, not quite, but I like it. Efficiency. We'll go the other way. Yes. You mentioned electrification. Oh, so what am I electrifying? Vehicles? Exactly. This is primarily electrifying the transportation sector. So modeling suggests that we have to basically double the size of the grid in order to electrify transportation. Now, if we think about efficiency, if we have more efficiency, what happens? What happens if we have more efficiency? We don't have to go as steeply. Maybe we only have to grow to 150, right? So then the curve basically gets less sharp. So that gives you a sense of the angle of what we have to do. And this represents like deployment rates about 8 times over historical best years. So this is the 2030 100% plan, which is the Bernie Sanders plan. And what I've done is delete the nuclear fleet, which people get mad at me for, but that is actually the plan because they don't want any license extensions for nuclear plants. And there are utilities today already saying we want to extend our licenses, primarily Duke. And so, you know, the point is you start a lot lower in terms of the amount of clean electricity we have. I believe it's 17 percentage points are hydro and renewables right now. So, and then of course we've got to do it by 2030 and we have to electrify transportation. So I just think this is really important to situate yourself because as Joe and I were talking about, there's such an ignorance amongst the media about what is the difference between these plans or what does it mean to say 2030 versus 2035, to say nuclear's in versus nuclear's out. It's hugely different in terms of the scale and speed and scope of the challenge. So now you're all educated, you can go and spread the gospel. Because as Johanna said, everybody's really into electricity. Just go home tonight and see if somebody will be interested in this conversation. They probably won't be, but you can try. So what are we going to do? So far, we've sort of heard carbon pricing said as the main thing. I don't really believe in carbon pricing anymore. I don't actually think that the California cap and trade system is working that well. Sorry, California. And I do not believe that that cap and trade will move us fast enough. And that's not an ideological point of view. It's an empirical point of view from looking at the history of carbon pricing and cap and trade around the world, including in the United States. So I'm far more bullish on things like standards. So a clean electricity standard. This is like a renewable portfolio standard. These policies have driven so much clean energy in the States. And I think scaling that up in terms of a clean vehicle standard could be really huge in terms of how we do this at the federal level. Energy efficiency, as I've mentioned, is really important. For every kilowatt hour that we don't use, that curve comes down, right? Because we don't need to have as much energy in the first place. So if you know the history of California, when Governor Brown was first in office, he did a huge push on energy efficiency. And what happened was energy and GDP decoupled in California. So basically energy went flat and GDP kept growing. And I think trying to do that at the national level could be huge. It's not simple, but we have all these reports for decades that basically show that there's tons of energy efficiency that's profitable to do right now, and yet we're not doing that. So really unleashing the power of the private market on energy efficiency, I think, has huge potential, because right now it's electric utilities that have been delivering a lot of energy efficiency programs, and that of course runs against their bottom line, even if they're decoupled. They're really bad at doing it. There's some efficiency programs that literally lose money. And so I kind of envision like a solar city, now Tesla model for this, where basically you have a third party that's going out and retrofitting your homes and getting money back from the government for doing that. I think that would work a lot better than the utility status quo. We probably need grants and tax incentives for deployment. We've already talked about how the investment tax credit and the production tax credit are going away. We heard somebody on the previous panel say that was fine with them. Not so fine with me. I think that if we need to scale up deployment on like 8 to 12 times, we need every dollar we can have, and the ITC and PTC expiration disturbs me deeply, and I actually think moving towards grants, as we had under the American Recovery Act, the 1603 program, would be really good. We need R&D, probably for a few key things, as the last panel talked about long-term battery storage. I also think negative emissions technologies are hugely important. We already have 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere this year. That is terrible, and we have to remove it out of the air, water, and land and stick it back underground. And we're going to have to probably pay a lot of people off who made absolutely terrible investments and completely abdicated their responsibility and lied about climate science for 3 decades, as we are currently seeing playing out in the Exxon case this week in New York State. But we're still probably going to have to pay them off. Too bad. So that I just showed you is about half the problem. That's it. That's 57% of US emissions, electricity and transportation. We also have, as Johannes talked about in the previous panel, a few other sectors that we have to deal with. So let's talk briefly through those. Buildings, we got to retrofit a lot of them and create new building standards for new builds. The Inslee and now Warren plan talks about retrofitting 4% of all buildings in the United States every year. It's like mind-blowing, right? Like, think about that. That's insane. But, you know, if we were able to do that, we wouldn't have to build as much of a new grid. You know, doubling the grid that took 120 years to build in 10 years is also pretty insane. The industry, we have heavy industry. It emits a lot of carbon, both directly through chemical reactions, like in cement manufacturing, and we need to figure out new ways of doing this. Now, some things like cement could actually become a negative emissions technology. There is potential for innovation in that sector where basically, did you know? So cement is a really old technology. It's been around basically the same for like hundreds of years. It's a certain chemical reaction. When cement is curing over the course of its lifetime, like decades, it's actually sucking carbon out of the air. Did you know that? It's true. Now, it's only sucking it out, I believe, about half as much as is during its life cycle. So if you could design the material such that it's sucking out more from the air while it's in the world than it produced through the chemical reaction, that would become a negative emissions technology. So that's hugely interesting. And the cement industry actually shows some movement in that regard. In agriculture, we have cows and fertilizer that we have to deal with. Of course, the thing that I like to talk about is the seaweed, feeding the cow seaweed. Turns out it's not like a silver bullet, but it might, for example, reduce methane emissions from cattle by like 50%. and we have to phase out the oil and gas industry. That'll be a small one. So that's it. If you're interested in this super wonky stuff, I have a book coming out that looks specifically at the electricity sector in American states and the ways that electric utilities have rolled back renewable portfolio standards and net metering laws. And it'll be out in March, and it's called Short Circuiting Policy. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Leah. I just wanted to highlight before carrying on that there's clearly a portfolio of policies and diverse perspectives on which ones are the most critical moving forward. Before I ask one of the next questions, I did want to start by drilling in a little bit more to the California federal dynamic that Vicki you started to talk about, and then open for comments on the federal state dynamics to the rest of the panel afterwards. But could we take a step back and you could maybe explain to our audience kind of from scratch what the challenge is, what is the status, and what this means for the future of the development of state policy potentially, and also those dynamics.
So, I mean, it's literally just out. I was reading it in the back of the room. And hopefully it doesn't mean a lot, because hopefully it won't get very far. Because when you really think about it, no matter what our policy preferences are, you know, whether or not you think markets work or they don't as currently constructed, but, you know, I would argue back, as much as I like standards, and I've worked in 2 offices of EPA and as a regulator in Louisiana too, I'm all for standards. Those are complementary policies that it shouldn't be an either or. Because you could get some of the rebound effect if you just keep prices low, if you don't also have a price signal. Plus, practically, you're generating revenues and proceeds that you can spend on all kinds of things, including the just transition. So I don't see it as an either or thing. And part of the experience that we're talking about and we're opining on is because states, as laboratories of democracy in our country, have actually done things, which is more than we can say for the most part of the federal government in the last 30 years, not just 20 years, since I've actually been working on this. I came to Washington, D.C. from the state of Louisiana, where I served Governor Buddy Roemer, who was both a Democrat and then became a Republican, so there you go. And there was a global warming task force back in the late 1980s, if you can believe it, that the National Governors Association had in anticipation of the impacts that we weren't yet seeing, but that anybody who just puts the physics together knows will be the future. And even then, you can go on Classic NGA. There's actually a website called Classic NGA and find this. You know, there were some statements made by the state governors of both parties who were sort of alarmed about what the future might look like and thinking about what policy approaches would make sense for them to take, their role as people who are on the front lines of these impacts, as well as at the federal level. And for the most part, you know, I've been working at the federal level, at the Pew Center, certainly on the earlier bills, and shifted to the state level at the time that Obama was coming in. So there was movement at the federal level as well. But, you know, as you can see, with the rollback attempts of the Clean Power Plan, which is still playing out in the courts, and the car standards, you know, that's far from a done deal. So what do we have? We have state leadership. And we've got to really try to keep that, because for us to stay anything close to on track of what we need to do from what the science tells us, but also the commitments under the Paris Agreement and Copenhagen, which is really just in line with the federal bills that people thought were possible. The only thing that we've got going for us is that at least half of the states now, I think, are in the Climate Alliance and are making their own commitments to try to stay on that trajectory. It doesn't mean it's easy. And it's one thing to make a statement like that. That's relatively easy. But the work that we do at our center is to serve the states every day and to actually put policies on the ground in place that actually move the needle. And that is not easy. And that does require a lot of public outreaches, which is why our Transportation and Climate Initiative has really, over the years, you know, worked on a very open public process that gets this kind of buy-in. And so the idea that a federal government will just wipe that away when the states are taking these actions for all kinds of reasons, I mean, climate leadership being one of them, but also to create clean energy jobs of the future, to deal with their resilience challenges, to be energy supply states like Texas when they started shifting from just being in oil and gas states to saying, hey, we've got wind and solar resources, let's go there. You know, it's really hubris and just shocking. I don't know how I can be shocked anymore by what this administration is doing, but after all these years, I have to say, I'm really shocked and disturbed today about this. I don't necessarily think it's going to be successful. I mean, some of the things that they have, I have it right here. Some of the things they have right here to argue that the state has overstepped its boundaries is that Schwarzenegger was invoking Spartacus and Sparta and Athens and, you know, I mean, he's like Schwarzenegger. He's a movie star. He's a bodybuilder. He'll never be president because he wasn't born here. And so, of course, California, which obviously is bigger in terms of its economy and population than other countries, you know, does have that kind of, you know, inflated, maybe you might think, you know, sense of their role in the world. But that doesn't mean that they can't enter into a voluntary agreement with another jurisdiction, whether it be another state. And there are compact clause challenges in here too, so that could be state by state agreements or across borders with Quebec, which has really, I think, a very good story to tell about their cap and trade program and how they've invested those allowances and promoted electric vehicle deployment much more quickly and things like that. So, I mean, it's disturbing, but I hope it's not going to go very far.
Well, I actually really appreciate your comments, and my students here know that I also agree with the aligned policy package approach and carbon pricing being an important part of that package that regions might consider as a complementary way to different clean standards. That said, I do want to open up because we clearly thinking through these questions of federal-state dynamics, if there are any other comments, what you see on the Hill, for example, Joseph, or other comments related to solar incentives, and then the federal environmental politics that I know, Leah, you're also an expert. Joseph, do you have anything to add there?
I think the only thing I would add, because I think Leah laid out a very nice articulation of the challenge that's ahead when you want to talk about a climate-induced energy transition, is that, you know, state and federal policy can be really good at different things. Right? And so when I think about federal policy, I kind of think about making general reforms that apply to a lot of different places or the whole population as a whole, and where a 2 or 3% change in the efficiency of some process or in fuel consumption or whatever yields a big emissions reduction. That might not be what we should be looking for when we talk about state level policy. California is perhaps a qualification there because it's so big, but you know, if you're talking about smaller states, really what I think the value of their project is finding suitable policy models for that region, for the lifestyles that people live in that place, and in particular demonstrating sort of small-scale decarbonization, if you will, right? That like the major transition can occur. So when I think about like what is the cool state policy model or even the local policy model that gets me excited working at the federal level, it's when you see these example building exercises, right? Like it actually can be done and we can do it efficiently and quickly and without leaving anybody on the sidewalk. And the party to that, or similarly, federal policy it can be good about a lot of things, about kind of setting EPA standards for fuels. Perhaps there's discussion of if there's big climate reforms in the next few years, carbon pricing or clean energy standards or a clean vehicle standard. But a lot of the things that Leah were talking about are just not really matters of federal policy as we think about them now. Urban planning, building standards, a lot of the things that we need to change over time have regional variation that I think it's kind of like, it is very cool to go 100% green, but like maybe the city should focus on densifying and reducing VMT. I think that's one way to think about it, that with the value of state and local policy, that sometimes it's like it's a little bit more exportable locally than it is a headline climate policy.
Well, and that's actually also a very good point because people seek to also get reelected, right? So, or to make their constituents happy. Catherine?
Yeah. I think this is a good point about the regional variation, but not just from the feel-good perspective, but from the actual legal structure, which is that states are in control of their electric generation resources. Nobody at the federal level can tell a utility, you have to build this thing. That's the state's job. That's the state's purview, and they are not giving it up anytime soon, I promise. So I think the big challenge that we face if we were ever willing to agree to a national climate policy is making sure that anything that gets put in place is a floor, not a ceiling. And this was a big part of, I mean, when you're at 100%, I guess there's the floor and the ceiling are the same. But this was a big part of the Clean Power Plan and the Waxman-Markey era RPS standards. If we're going to do something at the federal level that applies nationwide, we cannot, punish first mover states or second or third mover states. We're trying to bring up the bottom and the average across the country and not just say like, okay, at 20%, you don't get to do any more than that. But as we think about resource decisions, and Leah, Ohio is a perfect example of this, the state PUC gets to decide and issue a certificate for public convenience and necessity. It gets to say, yes, utility, invest your ratepayers' money in this new asset. The longer we let PUCs say yes and give directives that are using carbon emitting resources, like the further behind we are on that narwhal graph. SEIA has set a goal to generate 20% of our nation's electricity by 2030. So that's a good chunk. We are at 2.6% today. So yes, we are talking about expansion at unprecedented sorts of levels. 20% by 2030 is great. Almost no PUC is planning for this, and definitely no transmission planner in the country outside of California is planning for a 20% solar future, even while they are building transmission plans for what assets do we need to put in the ground to serve electricity in the 2020s. Like, that conversation is happening today in stakeholder meeting rooms and conference rooms, and the best case scenario is kind of like a 25-30% wind solar mix in the region. Nobody is saying 30% from wind plus 20% from solar. Let's go build that grid.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, and just one quick note as someone who's done a lot of work in natural gas as well, these more than tenfold increases and plus get sparked by drops in costs, which we know cost of solar in particular plummeting, not quite there yet, but hopefully something that we might see be able to support these increases in growth in the future. Leo, given your expertise on both environmental and federal state politics, would you like to contribute to the question of those dynamics moving forward?
Yeah, no, I think it's a huge issue, and I think that the expiration of the PTC and the ITC is extremely problematic, and I don't think it's the best policy we have. I mean, I don't think it's the best policy we could have, but it is the best policy we do have.
It's the best one we have.
Exactly,
yes.
That's what I mean to say. And I'm really disturbed about what that will do, because if you've actually looked at historical wind and solar deployment rates, which I do excessively, they bump up and down, and they bump up and down in large part as a function of the PTC and ITC expiration. So when things are going away, you get this huge rush, and I gotta say, it's really terrible from an economic planning perspective and a cost perspective, because what happens is, the PTC expires, everybody cancels a bunch of contracts for their wind turbines, then it comes back online, and everybody calls GE on the same day for their wind turbines, and then they say, okay, it's 20% more, right? Like, from a supply chain and workforce development perspective, it's absolutely disastrous, this boom and bust thing. So I am quite concerned that not only will we not grow as fast as we should be, but that we could actually reverse some of the gains. So for example, 2016 and 2017 were really big years for wind and solar. They grew so I do it in terms of percentage points of the 100% slice. So they grew about 1.5 percentage points of the 100%. So that's a lot. And then last year, they only grew by 0.5. So they fell a lot. So that kind of a pattern I find very disturbing. And I think that our federal government is completely abdicating its responsibility and does not understand the narwhal graph clearly and how terrible it is. And I will say, my concern with cap and trade or carbon taxes, which I know are getting a lot of play right now on the Hill, is that, if the oil and gas industry is for this, I got to kind of ask myself a question as to whether or not it's going to solve the problem, right? And I know partially they were for it in terms of this liability waiver issue, but now they're just for it even without that. And So I've looked a lot at the history of carbon pricing. For example, in Norway, they have the highest carbon price in the world pretty much in terms of offshore oil extraction. And it basically just functions as a severance tax, meaning that, yes, it generates revenue. I totally take the point, but it doesn't change behavior. So during that time period, emissions actually went up by 78% in that sector during that carbon price. And it's the highest in the world pretty much. It's like, it varies, but it's like $200 a ton, okay? This is way beyond what we're talking about. So there are huge supply side and demand side inelasticities, meaning nobody shifts their behavior when it comes to carbon pricing. And I see this too playing out a little bit in Canada, which I also am, I am Canadian, so I know a lot about Canada. The Trudeau government made a decision to do carbon pricing, and I think that's awesome. I'm very proud of them for doing that. However, the criticism that the Green Party just ran on in the election that just finished this week was that this isn't actually going to transition the Albertan economy away from the oil sands, away from oil and gas, into some other industry. And I think that's the problem with carbon taxes. They provide a small signal, they certainly generate revenue, but it is not enough of a signal to actually transition at the speed that we need to, or in some cases, transition at all. So that is where I worry that if we make that the centerpiece of a bill, which the Waxman-Markey, that was certainly the centerpiece. There was also a clean electricity standard in that too, and there was lots of workforce stuff. There's lots in the Waxman-Markey bill. But if that's the centerpiece of the bill, I think we're going to waste another decade. And I don't want to waste another decade because I plan to be alive in 2050. And so that's where I'm coming from. It's not an ideological perspective. It's really just an empirical perspective.
And maybe some self-interest.
Yeah, and self-interest not being dead in 2050.
Okay, so let me just interject for 1 second. The Alberta policy was actually designed as an intensity-based carbon tax. So it's actually designed to enable the oil sands industry to continue growing while the efficiency, so it did exactly what it was designed to do. The emissions intensity decreased, but the overall emissions are growing. So I would argue that using that one example might not be the most representative overall of carbon.
I didn't use the Albertan
But no, I'm just clarifying. And but there certainly are questions in terms of how policy design and how challenging that is in any of these systems, in addition to policy packages. Vicky, did you have some comments?
And just on Norway, I mean, they're an oil-producing country and they want to keep doing that. But they have invested in policies that are promoting use of electric vehicles, and 60% of new vehicles there are electric. So that actually can move the needle. And they're also electrifying their ferry fleets. And
electrifying their offshore platforms, as we heard in the last session. But that's not a solution to me.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying it alone is a solution if you're going to really still keep, pulling a lot of oil from the earth. But I'm saying that some of these policies to promote, for example, electric vehicles, which you can do if you generate funds somehow and buy down the cost of the electric vehicles, especially for people who otherwise can't afford it, like we talked about earlier with the equity, building out the charging infrastructure so people have more confidence in it, et cetera, really can move the needle.
Joseph?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to visit imright.com, but it's kind of like what I was saying, that the small-scale examples of decarbonization are really powerful and interesting. No one thinks a carbon tax at any level in Norway is going to solve our geophysical carbon problem, right? Well, like 7 people live in Norway.
It's like 5 million, but
right. But
it's like the city of Toronto, yeah.
It's like the city of Toronto?
Yeah, in terms of population, yeah.
How's their football team so good? But what it does show you is, we can operate a modern and productive society with a lot of electric cars in it, or we can figure out how to sell them to poor people, or we can do all these other things that then, larger emitting countries can learn from.
Okay, so I'm going to step in again. I do want to make sure there's lots of time, so we're going to do a last round. So anyone in the audience who has questions, think them up during this round, or I'll keep asking them. So, so you have this round to think asking them, but to think them up, and then we'll take questions. I'll take questions after this round. So let's kick this question period off by getting everyone in the panel. I want to hear what exactly, if you could come into this policy picture in the U.S. and you had the power to make one policy change in the upcoming year in the United States, what would it be and why? But I also would like for, clearly realistic as possible by coupling this with what political challenges might exist and how might they be overcome. Vicki?
So I'm going to go back to our Transportation and Climate Initiative because the states in this region on a bipartisan basis have agreed to deliver an MOU proposal by the end of this year, which is really unprecedented. So I give them a lot of credit and we help them a lot. And it's taking, input from everyone, which means it's really, really hard to do. So that's the challenge is that, from the right, while it might be true that some of the oil companies say they like markets, we're going to test that because generally they have fought them at the state and regional level. And I will say that there's a deep skepticism of cap and trade in the environmental justice community, even though I would argue that in the transportation sector, there are often some of the communities that could benefit the most from getting people out of like smelly diesel school buses and vehicles in general. But we're really, trying to make this happen this year. So I think it's both realistic and difficult at the same time. So I want to pick that one.
Okay, thank you. Joseph?
Meaningful carbon price assigned as broadly in the economy as we can get it. That is a hard political sell in today's Congress, and it will be in a year. But I think that that can be answered by making some smart investments around carbon capture and storage and other energy technologies to help make the transition. I think it's relatively easy to write and get through Congress compared to some alternatives. And we can use a mixture of tax reform and regulatory reform to help garner bipartisan support.
Quickly, before we go on to Catherine, do you want to make a brief, put your brief thoughts out there on 45Q and the carbon capture and storage incentive?
Yeah, it's kind of neat. They should write regulations to do it. So it's a tax incentive program that Congress passed about a year ago, I think. It was in the 2018 budget bill. It allows companies or entities that are capturing carbon dioxide and either utilizing it in some durable form, storing it in geologically, or using it for enhanced oil recovery, so helping it boost oil production processes. What I would call a carbon bounty. Some have called this a carbon price, but I don't think that's actually quite the right term. But the government will pay you to capture CO2 and put it into the ground. And this is like, it's meant to be the sort of ITC, PTC equivalent for carbon capture, because if we're ever going to have deep decarbonization in the US, it would be very, very helpful to be able to capture carbon from industrial processes, maybe from some power plants. And if we're ever going to have net negative emissions, then we're going to need an industrial carbon management. Or we're going to need a carbon management industry, and that has to start somewhere.
That's right, yeah, and just to point that out, I kind of see that and I go, because I'm doing a little bit of work right now with the engineering school on carbon capture and utilization. Those technologies are way out. It would be really fantastic if we could take carbon and turn it into a useful intermediate or something like that.
Chocolate.
Yeah, right. But heading that's so far out right now. So seeing even these small movements, I think, are a positive sign.
Yeah, I'll confess I'm a bit unconvinced by the I don't know that there's that much material need for the volume of carbon we're talking about. Eventually, it's going to go in the ground.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a good place to start.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Catherine?
Obviously, the easiest thing to do this year is to extend the investment tax credit. You guys knew that answer was coming, right?
Yeah,
Let me give you some fun facts. Research from SIA and our on-site research team concludes that extending the ITC, this would be a 5-year extension. It keeps the step downs for the tail end 2 years, so it just moves everything 5 years forward into the future. 113,000 additional jobs. $87 billion of additional investment over what we expect to see baseline, and 363 million metric tons of CO2 emissions offsets. We've got bipartisan support for this in Congress. What we need is a tax vehicle to move through the process and get this thing signed into law. Businesses plan ahead. They need to make medium-term decisions pretty much next week. So sooner is better. I agree with Leah, this is not the best policy for addressing carbon emissions and getting carbon out of our electricity system, but it is the best policy we've managed to put in place thus far. Yes. And so letting it fall by the wayside would be hugely detrimental to this big picture goal.
We're getting ready for questions, so I'm going to privilege students first, okay? So SAIS students first, if there's students from other universities too, and then later on we'll open up to non-students, okay? Leah, please do go ahead. Your one big thing.
Yeah, so I obviously fully support the ITC extension. My big thing is the clean electricity standard. I mean, it's crazy. People have been trying to pass this since the 1990s. The debates in Congress just go on, and I guess the closest we came was Waxman-Markey. It's interesting, a lot of people felt that the clean electricity standard that was part of that bill was very weak, but actually it would have pushed a lot of states to be doing better than they are, because it would have required 20% by next year, of which 8% could have been met, percentage points, could have been met with efficiency. So it really would have been 12 percentage points, which are like 12 percentage points by 2020, but like West Virginia, Ohio, like don't worry, there are places that are not meeting that goal. So yeah, I really feel that a lot of the progress we have been made has come through renewable portfolio standards, and doing that at the federal level is like my dream. I wish that would happen. And you know, to go back to this revenue thing, I hate doing this on the fly because I might be wrong, and you know, being an academic, you know, like being wrong is horrible. The rest of the world doesn't seem to care about facts anymore.
Like the president.
But yeah, I know, but we do. I believe, off the top of my head, that if you have a $50 carbon tax and it's economy-wide for all carbon, you only generate $90 billion a year in revenue, which, okay, 90 billion is a lot of money, but like, you know, when you're talking about the scale of spending that's probably necessary to do these things, I guess I just wonder if you're going to be able to generate enough revenue through that mechanism. Maybe you do it to help with certain low-income issues, right? Like to put more money into vehicle deployment amongst low-income communities, or public transit, or you know, solar deployment in low-income communities. Maybe you think about it that way. But you know, I feel that the revenue stuff, and of course, the revenue gets smaller over time, because theoretically we get rid of carbon over time. That may not actually happen, but that would be the goal. So that's why I feel like the standard is the standard, so to speak.
So it sounds like lovely things might happen out of this revenue, though. So that aside, I just felt like Santa Claus, you know, for that last round. I would like to open up and start with student questions. Do we have someone with a microphone? I think the first were up here, or there was a first hand up here, I think.
Hi, Jake Stockman, ERE student. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked the last panel, which is for electric vehicles, DC fast charging stations, as well as carbon capture and storage, there's going to be an immense infrastructure need. How's that going to happen?
$2 trillion infrastructure bill. We've been talking about it every week since January 2017, I think, right?
Every week
is infrastructure week. I feel like it's the...
And bad lawsuit week, too.
Most, you know, on Veep, where it's like, did the president call? I mean, that's what infrastructure week is at this point.
That's funny.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, facetious,
yeah, go on.
Unlikely for 2019. I mean, I would put it pretty unlikely for 2020 as well, but that's really the answer, is that major infrastructure investments like this start with federal dollars. They get state matching dollars. That's a smart way to set up a program, but the investment really has to come from this level. I will say very, very personally, I think this was the biggest failing of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, was the giant missed opportunity in 2009 to take advantage of incredibly low interest rates and fund major infrastructure investments to get us through the next 100 years. Our infrastructure system across the country, across the different sectors, go check out the American Society for Civil Engineers. They do an infrastructure report every year. I mean, the grid gets a D+, bridges are failing, roads are failing, transit is failing. I mean, we have needs. These needs cost money. We need to put the money where the needs are.
I think Vicki had a comment as well, and then I'll open up in case any others before Marjorie.
So there is a climate provision in the transportation bill that passed the Senate EPW. It's the first time there was a climate provision chapter in it. And I had the chance to testify on that. And they did put $1 billion aside for various investments, including to fund corridors that had been identified previously by the Department of Transportation that allow people to go from state to state more easily. So you got the privilege of having your corridor identified but not funded before. And so like funding those kind of things is a good idea. Having said that, I will say this, as an electric vehicle owner myself, there's power everywhere, you know? I mean, like I literally use just like a regular outlet when I go home and plug in. And even when I've taken trips like to Eastern Shore or Baltimore or other parts of Virginia, which is a pretty big state, it's nice if you have a fast charger and you can figure it out and it's open, but like there's never been a hotel or a place that I have stayed at that I can't just like plug it in. It's a little slow, but you can at least top it off. And if it's your only car and you really take a lot of long trips and you're not just commuting and all, it's an issue. But even now, I just think we just have to like do this reality check of like there's electricity everywhere. And so it's not like having to create a hydrogen infrastructure, for example. So that's just one way to think about it. But we definitely need to scale up. And one of the things that we've worked on is that there's other barriers to the infrastructure deployment than just money. And one of the things that I mentioned in the congressional testimony was trying to do away with some of the bans on allowing there to be charging infrastructure along, say, the highway medians and rest stops. Because right now, with a few exceptions, you can't have those kind of vending operations on the highways, mainly because historically they've wanted to drive people and dollars into the communities. So if you want to make it easy for people and keep it there while they're on the roads, you've actually have to change some elements of the law. It's not just about the funding.
Any other final comments before we go to Marjorie?
We're going to need a lot of it.
Marjorie?
Hi, my name's Marjorie. Thank you. This was really interesting. Thanks a lot, everybody. So I have been doing a lot of research recently on batteries, and I think that we can all agree that they're very necessary for this transition. But I have been exposed to some opinions that are quite scary in terms of both the cost and innovation. There's some people who really don't believe that we can get the innovation to the level or the costs low enough to really make them work the way they need to. And I was wondering, A, what you think about that, and B, if you see any other alternatives to batteries or what other ways we can make variable renewables work if we aren't able to get them to the ideal state.
Yeah, the cost can certainly be daunting. And great question, and it's an area in great need of innovation. Clearly there are alternative storage systems, but does anybody, would anybody like to start? Vicki, should we start with you?
I think the battery costs are coming down. I know there's a Porsche too from an electric vehicle standpoint, not that everybody can afford a Porsche, but that has a battery that's capable of charging much more quickly. So there are these improvements that are being made in different kinds of battery storage. Leah, you guys know probably more about it. My husband mostly gets excited about these things. He's a car guy. He grew up in Detroit. So he tells me these things, but I don't really retain them. But I think we need storage, right? I mean, I don't really see any alternative.
And also just remembering, I think it's on the order, globally it's 10 gigawatts, but there are actually some battery storage systems going into operation, which is a good sign, in addition to the other storage systems. Joseph, would you like to add to that?
The only thing I would say is that necessity is the mother of invention, right? This is pretty early in the process. We're going to need a lot of storage. There isn't necessarily a lot of price signal associated with building that storage yet. So you can look at Leah's graph and you can make a storage version of it, I'm sure, and you get really scared and you're like, oh, well, God, where are we going to get all the lithium, and the batteries cost some hundreds of dollars per kilowatt hour or whatever. Let's recall that this is done properly. This is a quick but not hasty thing, and I think we have time to answer a lot of these challenges. We also have other modes of storing energy. Finding the right balance between having a lot of distribution and a lot of storage are interesting engineering challenges that we have some capacity to make. We should be doing it a little bit faster than we probably are.
Yeah, and I would say the technology is there. What drives pricing is expanded markets and competition in the manufacturing sector. So the more storage we deploy globally, the cheaper the prices get here in the United States. It's delightful. California continues to be a leader on the policy front, so the first big assets that are being deployed in a grid integrated kind of way, apologies to AES and their PJM project, but in any kind of mass, is going to happen in California. So we will be able to see exactly what happens on the grid and how the performance works and how the long-term operations lead to, either redeploying with a new upgraded technology, or just how quickly does the system sort of wear itself out with different dispatch instructions. But the other piece of it is that there are other storage technologies that do not consist of batteries. So thermal storage is a known and proven technology, again, not widely deployed across the globe yet, but already available. We've got it attached to some concentrating solar power projects in the desert Southwest. It can be used in you can use it anywhere for anything. It's just in that context, the solar provides the heat. And then pumped hydro, which again is already deployed in the US, not widely, but there are all sorts of things that help add to sort of the firmness and the resilience of our grid system. I would argue that no individual power plant is 24/7 reliable and dispatchable. None. That's not true. Anyone who tries to tell you that is at the very least undereducated, if not trying to lie to you. So I think about it as a system, as a collective, whether that's within a state or within a regional transmission organization, whatever your size is. The size is one plant operating 24/7, 365. The question is, can we collectively deploy what we need on the grid? And that means different generation sources, different availabilities in terms of storage assets, and different mechanisms to use demand response, or to rely on energy efficiency programs to meet half of the 1% load growth you expect for next year. So I would take it up to the system level and think about, do we have what we need, rather than the individual plant level.
Yeah, if you want to feel less depressed, you should read this 2015 paper by McDonald et al. Chris Clack, who's a well-known modeler, wrote it as well. And it basically shows that if you build a high voltage DC transmission line in the US to bring the resources from the middle of the country to the coast, wind resources, for example, that you can reduce emissions with like very little cost and only have to have like 20% natural gas, for example. So transmission is a huge potential. It's obviously very difficult. It gets into state and federal jurisdiction issues, gets into local NIMBY issues, but I think transmission siting is really important. I would also say that ARPA-E is this really great organization that does innovation, and that the high watermark for funding is $400 million a year. That's the high watermark. Putting more money into that kind of a model, I think, which actually is like a potential thing in the current Congress, shockingly, is something that, you could have like a sunshot initiative for batteries. That's actually in the Sanders plan. It's one of the ideas I like in the Sanders plan, like a battery sunshot initiative, a sunshot being the DOE initiative to reduce the PV costs. So I just think like if the US actually tries, this is very solvable. And you can also have what's called variable, so you have variable low carbon resources and you have firm low carbon resources that can move, so geothermal being an example of that. People also talk about building modular nuclear reactors that have this thermal storage component, so that there's some part of it that basically expands the gigawatts that it can provide at any moment and has flexibility. So I just think that like if the US actually put money into energy innovation and deployment, this is quite a solvable problem in this country compared to Canada, for example, which is not as big of a country, does not have the same history of innovation in the same way, although the carbon engineering firm, which is the really big negative emissions technology, is actually based in British Columbia, so that's one example. But I just feel like the US is this insane innovation hub with the national labs, with ARPA-E, with the DOE, and that if money actually flowed here, I think it would be solved. So I wouldn't stress too much. I would just go read that McDonald article and like chill.
And as we move to the next question, I also want to ensure that all of you are challenged. The costs are not the only issue. There's going to be large costs over management of waste and all kinds of other life cycle costs that you will run into. But just because you run into a challenge, all of you SCICE students out there should be thinking through structured approaches to solutions. Question. I know there was a variety of questions in the back here too. Yeah, do you want to pass them to this group of students here, and then we'll start moving our way up if we have time? Sure.
Hi, Peter Nance, ERE student here at SAIS. I'd say much of the conversation, the national conversation over the last about 9 months has been dominated by the Green New Deal. It's a little bit short on the specifics, but one of the notable things it does do is tie in social, labor, economic goals. How useful or not useful do you think that is in terms of any plan moving forward in terms of political feasibility for achieving environmental goals?
I want to answer that. So I have a paper which got rejected from a journal yesterday, which deeply annoyed me because it was a bunch of Europeans who were like, this doesn't matter because it's America. And you're just like, are you serious? Anyway, the joys of peer review. The paper says, which I will now tell you all because we were trying to get it published at a press embargo journal, and that's not happening anymore, so who cares? We basically show that from a public opinion perspective, a climate bill that includes social and economic policy is more popular, a lot more popular, than a climate bill that does not. And we show that using what's called a conjoint experiment, which is basically you show people one bill, you show them another bill, and you're like, which one do you like more? Shockingly, they like having more social benefits like $15 minimum wage, affordable housing, all the ideas that have been talked about in the Green New Deal. They are popular. And the interesting thing is that they don't polarize, meaning that, yes, they're mostly bringing Democrats along, but they're not pushing Republicans out. Like, they're not becoming more negative. So they're not very polarizing. And things like a job guarantee, kind of a crazy idea, that it's actually really popular. That concept polls extremely well, and that also shows up in our research. So I think from a public opinion perspective, the logic of the Green New Deal, very, very sound. Now, from a legislative perspective, much more complicated because, you got to move a bill through a lot of different committees or get, the leadership to say we're not moving it through a lot of committees, which they could do. But I just think that you potentially bring in a lot of veto players where if you have a $15 minimum wage, which I obviously support, you might have like every small business in America coming and opposing your climate bill, right?
FFB will call you.
Right, which like you already have all the oil and gas industry and the utilities. And so the question is like, is the public support enough to overcome vested interests? And I think in the status quo Washington politics, definitely not. I have other research that shows that interest groups capture the congressional agenda. But the whole theory of change amongst this community is that you have people in the streets protesting, you have general strikes. That's what they're talking about. So I think if you were to have a moment where, like Roosevelt said, make me do it with the original New Deal, where you had people in the streets and there was a lot of outside pressure, then maybe it would expand the coalition and get through Congress. In the current state of Congress, no way in hell does it make it easier. But if you sort of have a Bernie Sanders view of the world, which I do not always have, but let's just pretend we do in this moment, that's the revolution, right? So you're going to have the revolution, people are going to be in the streets, and then you're going to make Congress give all these benefits. And I think the theory that's quite smart is that a carbon, like for so long we've been like, let's do climate policy, let's impose costs on you guys, yeah. And like people don't get behind that. And the next move was to say, as the Citizens Climate Lobby says, well, yeah, let's give you dividends and give you money back. And I still don't think that actually brings a lot of people along. And we're doing research in Canada on that shows it's not true.
So let's start to open up the other perspectives as well. Thank you very much, Leah. So we have about 5 minutes left. So we'll see if we have time for another question. But first, let's go to the other panelists for their opinions as well. Vicki, Joseph, Catherine, do you have?
So, I mean, I find out all that interesting. And, look, I've been at this 30 years and haven't succeeded. So, like, what do I know? But I will say, I think, comprehensive immigration reform, comprehensive climate policy, even Waxman-Markey, which, you might remember that, and I show my students this, I don't know about you guys, but, there was a Democrat mansion running in West Virginia, and he, in his campaign ad, took a gun and literally shot a piece of paper that said it was the climate bill. But my joke to the students is the bullet wouldn't have actually penetrated the climate bill because it got very, very long and complicated as it is, because it wasn't just cap and trade over the years. It was all these complementary policies that we've been talking about that got into building codes and a lot of things that traditionally, were not in there. And so, in a way, I think some people thought that fell under its own weight. And so to me, it's especially challenging to think about that you're doing all that, but you're also doing these other social policies that might be very good, but it certainly seems more complicated.
Yeah, and I would just very briefly add, my boss wrote a quite lengthy piece approaching this political argument that you can make this deal a lot more popular, and offered, I think, a pretty sound set of critiques that are not just tactical, but also are saying that just the intersection of people who both support large social programs and climate, if they're different and you have to get both their votes, the intersection gets smaller when you have to capture them both. And so you put yourself in a position where you may be sacrificing climate ambition, you may be losing supporters rather than gaining them. And that's not just a special interest question. But I refer you to niskanancenter.org for the full piece.
Oh, this is great to get the different perspectives. We have time for 2 more questions, okay? Will, you have the mic there?
We hear you. We hear you. It works.
So basically, the elephant in the room I feel like today is that because there's a certain political party in this country that's blocking a lot of passage of a lot of climate bills, especially on the state level, right? And statistically speaking, climate is the 5th most popular or most important issue in every election cycle, and climate voters is one of the lowest turnout issue voters in every single cycle. So I guess my question is that, 1, how do you kind of convert more people into becoming climate voters? And 2, how do you really get these guys to go to the voting booth to vote for the issue that they're deeply passionate about? And whether it's from an academic, political theory, or I understand SCIA as a nonprofit wing as well, C3 wing as well, or from think tank perspective.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent question. So the fact that, an excellent political question, but about how this is a major issue, how can we possibly ensure that it becomes an political enough issue to get people out voting and initiating some change, right? Thank you, Will. Is that about right? Okay.
So a call to action for the young people, especially in this room. Talk to people in your family about how this is, your future. And if you look at what happened with gay marriage, we really were able to change hearts and minds from going from advertising that was about like lawyers and, judges and robes, making this kind of like, head kind of plea to really more of like a heart conversation about, I just want to marry the person I love. What is wrong with that? And I think people really do need to start moving this up on their priority list. So that and for all of us who work in this field, connecting the dots between more immediate consequences, including health consequences that generally carry more weight with the public, is really imperative.
So Niskanen works primarily on the right side of the aisle. All of our leadership are former executives from libertarian organizations, so we take this kind of market-based approach to most of the policy areas that we work on, not just in climate. So I identify with the concern that this has become a deeply partisan issue, that the Republican Party in particular in the United States is intransient. It's been stuck in climate skepticism for way longer than is even remotely excusable. But I also can offer, I'm hopeful about that from my ground level perspective. There's a deeper appreciation that this is an issue that it's no longer a future problem. It's like a now problem. Mm-hmm. And that's expressed in voter opinion. That's expressed in the effects that members are seeing in their districts. And so as time marches forward, I think relatively rapidly, we'll be in a position where the climate debate is less like snowballs versus like Exxon new, and more like me and Leah arguing about like mandates versus markets. At least I hope.
But we won't use the word mandates. We'll use the word standards.
You never get, everybody gets to message things how they
They sure do.
And then I think as part of that, actually, I'm very positive about the youth movements and all that stuff. I think rising political saliency lifts all boats.
Yeah. I really think this is an on-the-ground grassroots movement. I mean, you guys can think of 2 groups in the United States of single-issue voters. Climate's not one of them, right? Guns, and what's the other one?
Abortion.
Abortion, that's right. So you have to get people as committed to screening their candidates through one lens and one lens only as other entities are about their issues. And population, like the demographic information about who votes, it's totally a numbers game. The millennials, 20s and 30s, you guys need to vote at greater turnout rates than the baby boomers. That's the only way to win. I mean, it is math, and we're talking addition here. 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. You have to vote at greater rates than the baby boomers. Yeah, that's big, broad brushstrokes, but that's also the only way to sort of make that change. I also think that if people want to get really organized, you go form a commune like in Idaho, and only maybe, somebody do the math here, but like you maybe only need 25,000 additional voters to go swing like a congressional seat and 2 Senate seats.
That went way different than I thought it was going to.
No, not with your guns. But get your like-minded people and, go take over, be a political force in a small state where the population, where the numbers are in your favor.
Oh man, what's that Netflix documentary that's all about that? Yeah, that's totally, anyway, very funny. So it's funny because Sean McAlvey, who runs Data for Progress, has that exact theory of change. I find it hilarious.
We don't all need to live in San Francisco, okay?
Yeah, so I love Vicky's idea. I think that's brilliant. And the change on gay marriage is totally true. And it came through media and sort of these one-to-one conversations, and it came really quickly. I think the issue with climate is that we have to remember that fossil fuel companies and electric utilities have run a concerted denial campaign for over 30 years to polarize the Republican Party. Like, this didn't just magically happen because Republicans don't like climate or something. Like, this is a very concerted campaign, and they did things like primary Republicans that were on the wrong side. Bob Inglis being an example of that at the federal level. You can read Cokeland, the book by Chris Leonard, or my book about what happened in Kansas with Koch Industries primarying Republicans who were pro-wind energy, because like wind energy is massive in Kansas. Anyway, so I think that the left has to start primarying in the other direction, and that's what groups like Sunrise are doing. They're saying, look, if you're not progressive on climate, you don't get to be in the party. Now, the challenge becomes when you come to somebody like Joe Manchin, maybe you primary him and then he loses. So how do you expand sort of the number of supporters, either on the right with Republicans to unpolarize it, or on the left where you're primarying sort of laggards? And I just think that we really have to be clear about what is necessary, not just talk about what's possible, but actually talk about what's necessary. And Greta Thunberg and Sunrise have been genius at changing the conversation in that way.
Okay, so I know I promised 2 questions, but I'm getting a little, that's it time. But I just wanted to say that really speaks to how incredible this panel has been. We've had diverse perspectives, opinions, a really wonderful conversation. For any of you who are waiting for a question, we will have a small reception now, so do keep those questions in your back pocket, and join me in thanking our panel for this excellent discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.